I came home early from a solitary fishing trip and found a stranger standing on my mahogany porch holding blueprints. That arrogant developer was just the symptom. The real disease was inside my house. My own son-in-law had filed papers to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could sell the lakefront estate I built with my own two hands. I did not yell. I simply made a phone call and dismantled their entire miserable scheme piece by piece. My name is William. I am 70 years old, and I know how to spot a fraud. Before I continue this story, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not inherited. The Georgia sun beat down relentlessly on the gravel road leading to my 50-acre lakefront estate. I returned 2 days early from my fishing trip on Lake Sinclair. My bones ached from the damp mornings, so I decided to cut the solitude short. I parked my battered Ford pickup a quarter mile down the bend, intending to walk the rest of the way and enjoy the quiet pine breeze. Martha and I bought this land 40 years ago. We cleared the brush ourselves. We built the house plank by plank. Now she is gone, and the silence here is my only companion. I reached the edge of my driveway and stopped dead in my tracks. A silver Mercedes SUV was parked directly on my manicured grass. A man I had never seen before stood on my wide mahogany porch. He was a young white man wearing a sharp tailored suit completely out of place against the rustic timber of my home. He unrolled a large sheet of architectural blueprints across my porch railing, casually tracing lines over the footprint of my house. I walked up the wooden steps. The heavy tread of my boots made him look up. He did not greet me. He did not ask my name. He took one look at my faded flannel shirt, my muddy boots, and my weathered dark skin, and made a fatal assumption. He pointed a manicured finger toward the roofline. "You must be the landscaper," he snapped, not even bothering to look me in the eye. "Tell the owners the gutters on the west wing are completely clogged. Get a ladder and clean them out before the appraisers get here tomorrow morning. We cannot have water damage lowering the property value." I stood perfectly still. I looked at his expensive Italian leather shoes. I looked at the blueprints detailing a luxury condominium complex right where my living room stood. My voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "Roll up your paper. Step off my porch. If your tires touch my grass for one more minute, I will call the sheriff and have your vehicle impounded for trespassing." The developer blinked, his arrogant smirk melting into utter confusion. He scrambled to gather his blueprints, dropping his expensive pen in the dirt, and practically ran to his Mercedes. He sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. I did not go through the front door. I walked around the side of the house and slipped my key into the kitchen entrance. I turned the lock with practiced silence. I stepped into the hallway. Voices drifted from the living room, familiar voices laced with venom. It was my daughter Michelle and her husband Logan. I pressed my back against the cool plaster of the hallway wall. Logan was pacing across the hardwood floor. Through the crack in the doorway, I saw him waving a thick manila medical folder in the air. "This is a disaster," Michelle Logan hissed, his face red with panic. "Dr. Evans absolutely refused to sign the dementia certification. He said your father is sharp as a tack. He threatened to report me for medical coercion if I asked him again." Michelle sat on the pristine white sofa I bought for her. She examined her fresh manicure, completely unfazed by her husband's hysteria. "Then find another Dr. Logan. Pay someone off. Do whatever you have to do." Logan threw the folder onto the coffee table. "The developer is losing patience. He was supposed to send his architect over today to map out the demolition. If we do not get emergency guardianship over your father by Friday, the deal falls through. If the deal falls through, the private equity guys are going to break my legs. We need him declared incompetent right now." I stopped breathing. The reality of their words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My own daughter, the girl I carried on my shoulders, the woman whose expensive college tuition I paid for in cash. She was sitting in my living room, casually plotting to erase my legal existence. They did not just want my house. They wanted to steal my mind. I shifted my weight. My heavy boot pressed down on a loose floorboard. A sharp creak echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. The frantic whispering in the living room ceased instantly. Logan spun around, his eyes wide with animal terror. He snatched the manila folder off the coffee table and shoved it deep behind the decorative cushions of the sofa. Michelle leaped to her feet, smoothing her designer dress, her face draining of color. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and walked into the living room. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not yell. I did not demand answers. I simply stared at the two people who were actively planning my demise. Logan swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously against his tight collar. The panic in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by a bright, sickeningly fake smile. It was the smile of a desperate salesman. William Logan said, his voice jumping an octave higher than normal. "We did not expect you back from the lake until Sunday. You startled us." He wiped his sweaty palms on his slacks and rushed over to the wet bar. "You must be exhausted from the drive. Let me get you something to drink. You look like you need to rest." He poured a tall glass of iced tea from the pitcher. His hands shook violently. The ice cubes rattled against the glass like castanets. He handed me the drink with that same plastic trembling smile. "Here, drink this. Go lie down in your room. We can take care of everything around here." I took the glass from his shaking hands. The condensation dripped onto my fingers. I raised the rim to my lips, but I did not drink. A faint, chalky chemical odor wafted up from the sweet tea. It was a smell I recognized instantly from my decades working in insurance fraud investigations. It was the bitter, unmistakable scent of crushed sleeping pills, a massive dose designed to knock a man out for days. I lowered the glass. I looked down at the amber liquid, then slowly raised my eyes to meet Logan's terrified gaze. The silence stretched between us thick and heavy. He was trying to sedate me. He wanted me unconscious so he could parade another corrupt doctor through my bedroom and steal my life. I did not throw the glass. I did not raise my voice. I just looked at him with absolute icy clarity. He knew that I knew, and I knew that his time was running out. I raised the sweating glass of iced tea to my lips. The sharp, bitter scent of crushed sedatives hit the back of my throat immediately. Decades investigating insurance fraud teach you how to spot a lie instantly. They also teach you how to play along perfectly. I let out a heavy sigh and tilted the glass back, making a loud gulping sound without letting a single drop pass my teeth. Logan turned away to grab a cork coaster from the mahogany bar cart. In that split second, I dumped the entire contents into the large potted fern beside the sofa. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and handed the empty glass back to him. Logan smiled broadly. His tense shoulders finally dropped. He looked like a desperate man who had just won the lottery. I immediately let my eyelids droop. I slurred my words, complaining about the long drive from the lake and a sudden crushing exhaustion taking over my body. Michelle watched me from her pristine white sofa with absolute indifference. She did not ask if I felt sick or tired. She merely checked her diamond watch, eager for me to leave her sight. I stumbled down the hallway, dragging my boots heavily against the hardwood floor. Every step was a meticulously calculated performance. I reached the master bedroom at the end of the hall. I stepped inside and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The loud click of the deadbolt locking into place echoed through the quiet house. I dropped the senile act instantly. My posture straightened. The fake lethargy vanished entirely. I stood in the center of the room Martha and I had shared for 40 years. My heart hammered against my ribs with a cold, precise rhythm. I needed to know exactly how much damage my son-in-law had already done. I walked purposefully toward the walk-in closet. The late afternoon sun filtered through the wooden blinds, casting long shadows across the polished oak floorboards. Something unusual caught my eye. Right near the edge of the large Persian rug, the wood was severely scarred. Fresh, jagged scratches ran deep across the varnish. Someone had dragged the heavy rug aside in a frantic hurry and failed to put it back exactly right. I knelt and pushed the rug completely out of the way. Underneath lay the hidden floor safe I installed a decade ago. The digital keypad looked untouched, but the heavy dial felt slightly loose to the touch. I punched in the 6-digit code. It was Martha's birthday. The heavy steel door groaned open. I reached into the dark cavity and pulled out the thick leather folder where I kept our most vital legal documents. My hands moved quickly, flipping through birth certificates, decades of old tax returns, and Martha's finalized life insurance paperwork. I reached the very back where the original deed to this 50-acre estate always sat. I pulled out the document. My fingers immediately recognized the wrong texture. The heavy textured parchment was completely gone. In its place was a flimsy piece of standard printer paper. I held it up to the light. The official county seal was flat and slightly pixelated. The signature was a perfect visual match, but it lacked the deep ink impression of a real pen pressing into paper. It was a cheap, high-quality color photocopy. Logan had broken into my safe. He stole the original deed to the land my wife and I cleared with our own sweat and blood. He needed the physical document to prove ownership to his wealthy developers. The realization solidified the cold knot in my stomach. A photocopy meant he was actively trying to cover his tracks to buy time. He thought I was a foolish old black man who would never check his own vault. He thought I would quietly fade into a heavily medicated sleep while he sold my legacy out from under me. I folded the fake deed and put it in my pocket. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. A sharp vibration against my thigh broke the dead silence of the bedroom. I reached into my denim pocket and pulled out my burner phone. I kept this secure device purely for financial alerts, completely separate from the expensive smartphone Michelle bought me for Christmas to track my location. The screen lit up with an urgent notification from my local bank. It was a high-level fraud alert. I opened the encrypted message. The text displayed a massive, unauthorized withdrawal. $15,000 had just been drained from the joint savings account I had shared with Martha. The transaction was processed at a teller window downtown less than an hour ago. The blood rushed in my ears. That account held the emergency funds Martha and I painstakingly saved during our leanest years. It was money meant for medical bills or property taxes, untouchable unless absolutely necessary. Logan did not just steal my land. He was draining my liquid assets to fuel his desperate escape. $15,000 was not a random number. It was the exact price of a high-end retainer for a corrupt medical professional or a dirty lawyer willing to expedite a fraudulent guardianship order. Logan was using my own hard-earned money to pay the people who were actively trying to erase my legal existence. The pieces of his scheme interlocked perfectly. Steal the deed, drain the cash to bribe the right officials, drug the old man to secure the medical diagnosis, hand the property over to the developers. He was financing my destruction with the money I earned working double shifts. He viewed my life savings as his personal slush fund. I stared at the glaring red numbers on the small screen. He had forged my signature at the bank just as easily as he replaced the deed. The audacity of his crime revealed the depth of his desperation. He was a drowning man grabbing onto my neck to save himself. I locked the burner phone screen and slipped it back into my pocket, calculating my immediate counterattack. Before I could dial the fraud department, a faint scraping noise echoed from the bedroom door. I froze. A dark shadow blocked the sliver of light under the doorframe. Someone was standing right outside my room. I heard the unmistakable metallic clink of a key sliding into the brass keyhole. The doorknob rattled slowly. Logan was not waiting for tomorrow morning. He believed the heavy dose of crushed sedatives in the iced tea had already knocked me into a deep, unresponsive stupor. He was coming into my bedroom right now to finish whatever sinister task he had planned. He needed to plant false evidence or ensure I was completely incapacitated before he moved forward with the developers. I backed away from the safe and grabbed the heavy brass lamp from my nightstand. I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal base, bracing myself in the shadows. The deadbolt clicked open with a sharp snap. The door began to slowly swing inward. I stepped back just as the brass knob clicked. The heavy oak door swung inward with a slow creak. I did not wait for his eyes to adjust to the dark. I lunged forward and grabbed the brass handle, yanking the door open with a violent surge of force. Logan stumbled across the threshold, completely losing his footing. The sudden momentum threw him entirely off balance. His right hand shot out to catch himself against the doorframe. His fingers were wrapped tightly around a medical syringe filled with a clear liquid. The moonlight streaming from the window caught the sharp gleam of the needle. He genuinely wanted to inject me while I slept. He wanted to ensure my complete submission to his fabricated medical narrative. Decades of grappling with desperate fraudsters on the streets of Atlanta kicked in instantly. My age had slowed my running pace, but my physical grip remained like iron. I stepped directly into his blind spot and snatched his right wrist. I twisted his arm downward with a sharp, agonizing wrench. Logan let out a high-pitched shriek of pain. The syringe slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered harmlessly onto the hardwood floor. He dropped to his knees, gasping for air. I did not give him a chance to recover or formulate a new lie. I drove the flat of my heavy boot directly into his chest. The impact sent him skidding backward into the hallway. He hit the opposite wall with a loud, satisfying thud. I slammed the bedroom door shut in his face and manually engaged the deadbolt. My breathing remained perfectly steady. I turned to the massive oak dresser Martha had inherited from her grandmother. I planted my boots against the floorboards and pushed with every ounce of strength I had left. The heavy wood groaned in protest before sliding across the room. I wedged the dresser tightly against the doorframe, creating an impenetrable barricade. Logan began pounding his fists against the wood, screaming my name in a panicked frenzy. I ignored him completely. I stepped away from the barricaded door and pulled my burner phone from my pocket. The digital clock on the screen read exactly midnight. I dialed a number I knew by heart. The line rang twice before my son answered. Anthony lived in Chicago, working long hours as a senior forensic accountant for a major firm. He had inherited my analytical mind and his mother's unyielding loyalty. I did not waste our time with pleasantries or emotional outbursts. I spoke in sharp, precise sentences. Logan just tried to drug me with a syringe, I told him directly. He replaced the original property deed with a cheap color photocopy and withdrew $15,000 from the joint savings account I held with your mother. He is actively trying to secure a fraudulent medical guardianship to sell the estate to a commercial developer. Anthony did not gasp or ask foolish clarifying questions. His voice shifted instantly into a state of professional detachment. "Are you safe right now inside the house?" he asked. I confirmed my door was heavily barricaded and that I was unharmed. I then provided the exact details he needed to launch a digital counteroffensive. I gave him the license plate number of the silver Mercedes SUV parked on my lawn earlier that afternoon. I recited the transaction identification number and the exact timestamp from the fraudulent bank withdrawal alert. I need to know exactly who Logan is meeting with and why he is desperate enough to attempt medical coercion, I instructed firmly. Anthony typed furiously on his end of the line. The rapid clicking of his mechanical keyboard echoed clearly through the phone speaker. He possessed high-level clearance to access public real estate databases, corporate registry files, and hidden digital financial footprints. He knew exactly how to track ghost transactions and uncover hidden liabilities. "Give me 10 minutes, Anthony said, his tone turning dangerously cold. "Lock the windows and do not let the police inside until I call you back with the facts." He hung up the phone. I stood in the dark center of my bedroom listening intently. The pounding on the door had completely ceased. The hallway outside fell deathly silent. Logan was regrouping his thoughts. He realized his physical ambush had failed, which meant he would pivot to his next available strategy. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals rely on highly destructive instincts. I checked the latch on my window and waited in the shadows. Exactly 10 minutes later, my burner phone vibrated in my palm. I answered the call immediately. Anthony did not bother saying hello. "The silver Mercedes belongs to a shell company registered in Delaware," Anthony stated rapidly. "But the holding company links back to a commercial development group operating out of Atlanta. Logan is entirely compromised." Anthony broke down the harsh financial reality with clinical precision. Logan's boutique real estate brokerage firm was currently facing a massive federal audit. He had been secretly shifting client funds to cover his own luxurious lifestyle and terrible investments. To hide the missing money before the federal inspectors arrived at his office, Logan took out a desperate unauthorized loan. He borrowed $3 million from an unregulated private equity firm. Anthony explained that this specific equity group served as a legal front for violent loan sharks. They charged predatory interest rates and enforced their collections with severe physical violence. Logan's absolute deadline to repay the $3 million was the end of this week. "He is totally broke," Anthony explained. "His credit is maxed out across all channels. His business accounts are frozen pending the federal review. Your 50-acre lakefront estate is his only ticket out of a shallow grave." The developers offered him exactly $4 million in cash for an expedited off-market sale. He plans to pay off the loan sharks, secure his freedom, and likely abandon Michelle the moment the wire transfer clears. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me. Logan was trying to trade my life and my legacy for his survival. I instructed Anthony to secure a flight down to Georgia immediately. Before Anthony could confirm his flight details, a piercing shriek shattered the silence of my home. The harsh, high-pitched screech of the hallway smoke detector kicked in, followed immediately by the secondary alarms in the guest bedrooms. The synchronized blaring vibrated against my eardrums. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. A thick, acrid smell seeped through the small gap beneath my bedroom door. It was the undeniable stench of burning plastic-scorched synthetic fabric and lighter fluid. Logan had not retreated to lick his wounds or rethink his strategy. He had pivoted to a terrifying contingency plan. He was intentionally setting a fire in the hallway right outside my room. His strategy was brutally obvious and utterly ruthless. He wanted to force me out of my barricaded sanctuary. By creating a massive emergency, he could summon the fire department and the local police to the property. He planned to point at the flames and claim my mind had finally slipped beyond repair. He would tell the authorities his senile father-in-law had wandered into the hall and accidentally set the house ablaze. He was actively manufacturing the ultimate crisis to seal my incompetence. I turned my back to the heavy oak door and dropped to one knee. I reached under the bed frame and pulled out the heavy-duty industrial fire extinguisher I kept stored there for emergencies. Decades of working major fraud cases taught me that desperate men love to use fire to erase their problems. I yanked the metal safety pin out with one swift, practiced motion. I braced my boots against the floorboards and pushed the heavy dresser away from the doorframe. The wood scraped loudly against the floor, clearing the path. I gripped the brass doorknob and pulled it open. Thick, toxic black smoke rolled into my bedroom instantly. The acrid smell of burning synthetic carpet and lighter fluid stung my eyes. A localized wall of flames licked up the vintage wallpaper just outside my door. Logan had piled chemical-soaked rags directly against the baseboards to ensure the fire blocked my only exit. He wanted me trapped inside the room. He wanted me to die inhaling toxic fumes while he played the grieving survivor on the front lawn. I raised the nozzle and squeezed the trigger hard. A massive blast of pressurized dry chemical foam erupted from the extinguisher. I swept the hose from side to side, attacking the base of the fire with cold precision. The flames choked and died within seconds, leaving behind a suffocating cloud of white dust and scorched drywall. I stepped through the smoke, my boots crunching over the chemical residue. Logan stood at the far end of the hallway near the main staircase. He held his smartphone to his ear. His designer suit was perfectly clean. He did not look like a man trying to save his father-in-law. He looked like a man waiting for a corpse to burn. When he saw me step through the white smoke completely unharmed, his jaw dropped. His fake panic faltered for a fraction of a second before he remembered his performance. He screamed into his phone, begging the dispatcher to send help faster. He shouted that his elderly father-in-law was trapped in the blaze. Flashing red and blue lights immediately illuminated the front windows. The wailing sirens of the local fire department and county sheriff's cruisers cut through the night. Logan had timed his call perfectly to ensure they arrived exactly when the fire reached its peak. He rushed to the front door and threw it open, waving the first responders inside with frantic theatrical gestures. Sheriff Miller stepped into the foyer with two heavily armed deputies right behind him. Firefighters rushed past them with heavy hoses, barking loud orders to secure the perimeter and ventilate the smoke. Logan immediately lunged forward and grabbed the sheriff tightly by the arm. He contorted his face into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Logan pointed a trembling finger at me as I stood quietly in the hallway, covered in white extinguisher dust. He told the sheriff I had completely lost my mind. He claimed I woke up in a state of severe dementia, wandered into the hallway, and accidentally set the house on fire while trying to cook a meal on a non-existent stove. My daughter Michelle burst through the front door seconds later. She threw her arms around Logan and began to sob hysterically. She buried her face in his chest, performing the role of the traumatized, loving daughter to absolute perfection. She cried out to the sheriff, pleading with him to understand that I was deeply sick. She spun a fabricated tale about how my cognitive decline had become a massive danger to the entire community. She told the officers that she and her husband were simply trying to care for a violent, senile man who refused to seek medical help. Sheriff Miller listened to their frantic narrative. He looked at the charred baseboards and the empty fire extinguisher in my hands. His hand rested cautiously on his utility belt. He approached me slowly, treating me exactly the way you would treat an unpredictable, dangerous psychiatric patient. He asked me in a slow, patronizing tone if I knew what year it was and if I realized I had just endangered my family. I did not raise my voice. I did not waste my breath arguing with people who had already rehearsed their lies. I looked Sheriff Miller square in the eye and spoke with absolute, unwavering clarity. I told him I knew exactly what year it was and I knew exactly who started the fire. I asked the sheriff to step into the kitchen with me. Logan tried to block our path, insisting the house was unsafe and filled with toxic air, but the sheriff firmly pushed him aside. I walked to the kitchen island and pulled my secured tablet from the hidden drawer beneath the counter. I tapped the screen and opened the encrypted security application. I had installed micro cameras in the crown molding of every hallway 3 months ago, long before they ever thought to target me. I turned the tablet around and handed it directly to the sheriff. The high-definition infrared footage played silently on the screen. It clearly showed Logan sneaking down the dark hallway holding a plastic container of lighter fluid. The video captured him meticulously piling old rags against my bedroom door, soaking them in the accelerant and striking a match. It showed him standing back and watching the flames grow before finally pulling out his phone to call emergency services. Sheriff Miller watched the footage twice. The patronizing concern on his face vanished entirely, replaced by cold, hard anger. He recognized a premeditated crime when he saw one. He handed the tablet back to me and turned around to face my son-in-law. The undeniable proof of felony arson hung heavily in the air, trapping Logan in his own web of lies. The sheriff glared at Logan with pure contempt. He unclipped his radio and took a purposeful step forward to place my son-in-law under arrest for attempted murder and arson. Before the sheriff could issue the command, a tall man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped aggressively through the shattered front doorway. He carried a leather briefcase and an air of absolute arrogance. It was Logan's high-priced corporate attorney. The lawyer stepped directly between the sheriff and Logan. He ignored the police entirely and marched straight toward me. He shoved a thick stack of legal documents forcefully into my chest. He declared in a loud, commanding voice that I was officially being served. He announced to the room that a federal judge had reviewed a preliminary medical petition filed by my daughter just 3 hours ago. Logan and Michelle had not just called the police to frame me. They had used the chaos to legally maneuver behind my back. The lawyer stated that Logan had officially filed for emergency medical guardianship. He informed me that as of this exact moment, my bank accounts were frozen and my legal rights were temporarily suspended. The harsh morning sun spilled across the kitchen floor, illuminating the legal papers scattered across my dining table. Logan's lawyer had left a mess of injunctions and emergency orders. The legal trap was meticulously constructed. Logan had weaponized the family court system overnight. I did not panic. I did not scream. I planned. I needed an unimpeachable medical authority to dismantle his narrative before the judge granted permanent guardianship. I opened my laptop and pulled up the directory of top-tier private psychiatrists in the greater Atlanta area. I found a highly credentialed specialist willing to conduct an immediate independent cognitive evaluation for a premium out-of-pocket fee. I pulled my Platinum credit card from my wallet and typed the numbers into the secure payment portal. The screen refreshed with a glaring red error message. Transaction declined. I frowned and tried a different card. Declined. I picked up my burner phone and dialed the automated banking service. The robotic voice confirmed my worst expectation. Every single account tied to my name was locked. Logan's emergency court filing did not just suspend my legal rights, it severed my financial lifeline. He had frozen my checking accounts. He had frozen my retirement fund. He had frozen the modest pension Martha and I relied on. I was a man with a 50-acre estate and $0 to my name. Logan believed stripping me of my wealth would paralyze me. He believed an old man without money was an old man without power. He was wrong. My power never came from plastic cards or banking institutions. My power came from the people who stood by my side when the money disappeared. I dialed Anthony's number. Anthony arrived exactly 90 minutes later. He did not drive his rental car down the main driveway where Logan had positioned a private security guard. My son parked a mile down the dense dirt road bordering the eastern edge of the lake. I slipped out through the basement cellar doors, moving silently through the thick Georgia pine woods I had hunted in for 4 decades. The damp soil masked the sound of my boots. I emerged from the tree line and slid into the passenger seat of Anthony's dark sedan. My son did not offer useless words of comfort. He put the car in drive and accelerated toward the state line. We had a 3-hour drive ahead of us, and every minute counted. Logan had the local judges in his pocket. He had the local medical boards intimidated by his aggressive corporate lawyers. We had to remove the battleground entirely from his jurisdiction. We crossed into federal territory just before noon. The facility was a highly secure, government-funded neurological research center. The waiting list for an evaluation spanned 8 months for civilians. I was not a civilian today. During my 30 years investigating massive insurance fraud rings, I had uncovered a multi-million-dollar pharmaceutical embezzlement scheme that saved this exact institution from total ruin. The current chief of neurology owed me his career, his reputation, and his freedom. I walked through the sliding glass doors, bypassing the crowded waiting room entirely. The receptionist tried to stop me, but the chief stepped out of his office and waved us straight to the specialized examination wing. He was an older, stern man who did not tolerate medical corruption. He looked at the court subpoena I handed him, reading Logan's fabricated claims of severe dementia and violent instability. The chief folded the paper and looked me in the eye. He promised a grueling objective assessment that would hold up in any federal court in the country. He warned me that the test would push my cognitive limits to the absolute brink. I rolled up my sleeves and sat in the sterile examination chair. I was ready. I was ready to prove my mind was a steel trap. I was ready to dismantle their lies. I was ready to destroy Logan's narrative. The evaluation was utterly merciless. For 3 uninterrupted hours, the chief of neurology hammered my brain with complex spatial reasoning puzzles, rapid-fire memory recall tasks, and advanced logical deduction exams. He tested my short-term retention, my long-term factual recall, and my neurological reaction times under extreme verbal stress. I did not falter. I did not hesitate. I did not show a single ounce of fatigue. I answered every question with the cold, calculated precision of a man fighting for his own life. When the final timer buzzed, the chief leaned back in his chair and stared at the diagnostic readouts on his monitor. He shook his head in quiet disbelief. My cognitive scores were not just normal for a man of 70 years old. They ranked in the 99th percentile across all age demographics. My mind was fundamentally flawless. The chief did not print a physical copy of the results. He knew physical papers could be stolen, shredded, or dismissed as forgeries by Logan's expensive lawyers. Instead, he logged into the secure federal health registry. He uploaded my flawless diagnostic results directly into the immutable government database. He attached his sworn medical affidavit to the digital file, legally certifying my absolute sanity and supreme cognitive function. Once the upload progress bar hit 100%, the data became permanent. No local judge could ignore it. No corporate lawyer could suppress it. No corrupt developer could challenge it. Logan's entire emergency guardianship petition was now legally dead on arrival. We had the ironclad weapon we needed to strike back. I stood up and shook the doctor's hand, feeling the crushing weight of the legal threat begin to lift from my shoulders. I stepped out into the facility's quiet waiting room. Anthony sat in the corner, his laptop balanced on his knees. The harsh blue light of the screen illuminated his tense facial features. He did not look up when I approached. He stared at the scrolling data with unblinking intensity. His knuckles were white against the edge of the keyboard. "We have the medical clearance," I told him quietly. "We can go to the local authorities and dissolve the court order today." Anthony slowly turned the laptop screen toward me. His voice was completely hollow. "We are too late to stop the money," he whispered. He had bypassed the encrypted firewalls of the private equity firm backing Logan. The financial ledger displayed a finalized transaction from 3 days ago. Logan did not just steal the physical deed to buy time. He had already weaponized it. He submitted the stolen deed to the loan sharks as hard collateral. The screen clearly showed a $500,000 wire transfer sent directly to Logan's offshore account. Attached to the loan agreement was a digital scan of the authorization form. My blood turned to ice. At the bottom of the page sat a perfect, flawless forgery of my own signature. I leaned closer to the glowing laptop screen resting on Anthony's knees. The high-resolution scan of the loan authorization form illuminated the dark interior of the rental car. The $500,000 principal amount sat heavily at the top of the page, but my eyes locked entirely on the ink at the bottom. The signature spelled out my full legal name. To a passing bank clerk or a careless loan officer, it looked passable. But a man who spent 30 years deconstructing insurance fraud syndicates does not look at a signature as a whole. He looks at the skeletal structure of the ink. He looks at the pressure points, the hesitation marks, and the angles of the loops. I traced the curve of the capital W with my index finger against the glass screen. Logan was a left-handed man who wrote with sharp, aggressive slants. The ink on this document flowed with a distinct, practiced fluidity. The top of the W carried a sweeping, extravagant loop that curled back onto itself before dropping into the next vowel. My stomach dropped into a cold, bottomless abyss. I knew that specific pen stroke. I had seen it on thousands of school permission slips, birthday cards, and tuition checks. It was the exact, unmistakable flourish my daughter Michelle used to sign her own name. Logan had not forged the document. He lacked the finesse. He lacked the intimate knowledge of my handwriting. Michelle had held the pen. My own flesh and blood sat in a notary office and meticulously committed felony wire fraud to leverage her childhood home to violent criminals. Anthony watched the realization wash over my face in the dim light of the car. He did not need to ask who wrote it. The silence stretching between us carried the entire weight of the betrayal. I raised a daughter, paid for her private education in full, and walked her down the aisle. In return, she sold my legacy and my safety to a syndicate of loan sharks to fund her husband's sinking ship. The shock dissolved rapidly, replaced by a terrifying crystalline clarity. I closed the laptop screen. I told Anthony to start the engine and drive me straight back to the lakefront estate. The time for gathering evidence was over. The time for confronting the poison inside my house had arrived. Anthony parked his sedan near the edge of the county road, keeping out of sight. I walked up the long gravel driveway alone. The front door of my house stood wide open. I stepped over the threshold and immediately heard the sound of shattering glass. I moved silently into the foyer and looked into the grand living room. Michelle stood on a small stepladder. She was aggressively yanking Martha's antique African art off the plaster walls. These pieces were irreplaceable wooden masks and vibrant tapestries my wife had carefully collected during our travels decades ago. Michelle carelessly tossed a carved ebony figure onto the floor, splintering the frame of a nearby family photograph. A frightened interior decorator stood near the fireplace holding a clipboard and looking incredibly uncomfortable. Michelle pointed a demanding finger at the blank space on the wall. She ordered the decorator to paint over the warm terracotta colors immediately. She complained loudly that the entire house looked far too ethnic and deeply dated. She insisted the space needed to be sterilized and neutralized into a modern minimalist aesthetic because the wealthy white developers would never finalize the luxury purchase if the property looked like a cultural museum. She completely disregarded the fact that this house was a sacred monument to her mother's heritage and our family's entire history. She was actively erasing our existence from the walls to appease the very people stealing our land. I stood in the doorway watching my daughter dismantle my home piece by piece. The sheer disrespect radiated from her every single movement. I did not announce my presence. I simply walked forward, letting my heavy boots announce my arrival against the hardwood floor. The decorator gasped and took a quick step back. Michelle turned around on the ladder. Her initial surprise quickly morphed into an expression of intense annoyance. She climbed down and crossed her arms over her chest. She asked me where I had been and demanded to know why I had wandered off while Logan was busy dealing with the courts. I did not answer her questions. I walked directly to the heavy glass coffee table in the center of the room. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out the thick stack of papers Anthony had printed for me in the car. I dropped the $500,000 hard money loan agreement directly onto the glass surface. The loud smack of the paper hitting the table echoed through the room. The interior decorator quickly excused herself and scurried out the front door, sensing the immediate and profound danger in the air. I stared at Michelle. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or display a single ounce of uncontrolled anger. The silence was a much heavier weapon. I pointed down at the signature line on the final page of the contract. I told her I knew Logan owed $3 million to a private equity firm backed by violent loan sharks. I told her I knew the exact offshore account where the loan funds were deposited. Finally, I told her I recognized the distinctive loop on the capital letter of my forged signature. I demanded a full and complete explanation. I demanded to know exactly when she decided to sell her own father to the mob to finance a fraudulent lifestyle she could never afford. The coldness in my voice was absolute. I was no longer speaking to my daughter. I was interrogating a completely hostile suspect. Michelle looked down at the forged signature. She did not cry. She did not fall to her knees and beg for my forgiveness. Instead, her face hardened into a mask of pure entitlement. She sneered at me and completely abandoned any pretense of familial love. She screamed that she truly deserved this money. She declared that she was suffocating in this rustic, backward town and needed the capital to secure her proper place in high society. She blamed me for living a simple life when my estate was worth millions. I warned her that felony wire fraud carried a massive federal prison sentence. Michelle let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She stepped right up to my face, her eyes blazing with absolute malice. She told me that if I did not voluntarily sign the final deed transfer over to the developers by tomorrow morning, she would go directly to the family court judge. She threatened to file a sworn affidavit claiming I had severely abused her throughout her entire childhood. She promised to completely destroy my reputation, drag my name through the mud, and ensure I spent my final years rotting in a state penitentiary. I stood in the center of the living room and stared at the woman I had raised. The silence was absolute, heavier than any shouting match could ever be. Michelle did not drop her gaze. She stood there, her chin jutting out, her eyes blazing with an entitlement so deeply ingrained it had completely rotted away her conscience. She had just threatened to perjure herself in family court. She had threatened to completely destroy my reputation with fabricated allegations of abuse simply because I would not hand over the land her mother and I bled for. I looked at her manicured hands. Those were the same hands that had forged my signature on a $500,000 loan to appease violent mobsters. I felt no anger. I felt no lingering parental affection. The final tether snapped. "You died to me the exact moment you put that pen to paper," I told her. My voice was a low, even rumble devoid of any emotion. "You sold your soul to finance a lifestyle you never earned, and you thought you could use my life as your currency." I turned my back on her before she could open her mouth to issue another pathetic threat. I walked out of the house. I did not slam the heavy oak door. I let it click shut quietly behind me. The Georgia sun felt different on my skin now. The air was clearer. I walked the mile down the dirt road and slid back into the passenger seat of Anthony's sedan. We drove away from the lakefront estate and headed into the nearest town. We pulled into the gravel lot of an old diner I used to frequent during my days as a fraud investigator. We walked to the back booth. A man in a sharp charcoal suit was already sitting there sipping black coffee. It was Robert Hughes, an attorney I had trusted for over 3 decades. Robert did not offer useless platitudes about family betrayal. He knew exactly why we were sitting in this diner. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a weathered, faded yellow folder. The edges were soft and worn from years of sitting in a fireproof vault. Robert placed the folder on the Formica table and slid it toward me. He tapped his index finger against the thick stack of legal documents inside. He wore a grim, satisfied smile. "Logan thinks he holds the winning hand because he possesses the physical deed to the property," Robert said, his voice dropping an octave. "Logan believes he controls the asset because he initiated the emergency guardianship proceedings to freeze your personal accounts. But Logan is a deeply stupid man who failed to conduct a basic title search beyond the county clerk's surface records." Robert opened the yellow folder and revealed a perfectly preserved legal document stamped with a federal seal. 10 years ago, right after Martha received her final medical diagnosis, she and I sat down with Robert to secure our legacy. We did not want our hard-earned wealth subject to probate courts or predatory creditors. We executed a flawless, impenetrable legal maneuver. We placed the entire 50-acre lakefront estate, along with all associated liquid assets, into an irrevocable trust. The specific legal structure of this trust meant that I, William, did not legally own a single blade of grass on that property as an individual. I was merely a designated beneficiary. The trust owned the land. The trust owned the house. The trust held the ultimate authority. Logan had broken into my floor safe. He had stolen a piece of paper that held absolutely no legal weight. The deed he possessed was effectively a historical relic. Furthermore, Logan's attempt to freeze my personal bank accounts was entirely irrelevant to the estate. The land could not be sold, leveraged, or transferred without the explicit, notarized authorization of the designated executor of the irrevocable trust. And the designated executor was not me. I looked across the diner table at my son. Anthony was the sole legal executor of the trust. Logan's entire scheme was built on a foundation of sand. Robert tapped the table. He advised us to contact the federal authorities immediately. He wanted to march into the local precinct, present the irrevocable trust documents, and have Logan and Michelle arrested for the forged loan signature before the sun went down. I shook my head. I placed my hand firmly over the yellow folder. "That is a terrible strategy," I stated. "If we expose the trust right now, Logan will panic. He will realize his hard money loan is entirely fraudulent, and he will flee the state before the loan sharks catch him. The local prosecutor might offer Michelle a plea deal for the forgery, and she will spend the next 5 years playing the victim in a minimum security facility. That is not justice. That is a minor inconvenience. I wanted absolute, inescapable destruction." Logan was currently negotiating a $4 million cash sale with the commercial developers. I wanted him to proceed. I wanted him to stand in a room with those wealthy corporate executives and confidently sign his name to the final sale documents. The moment Logan executes a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction across state lines using a forged deed, he triggers a cascade of severe federal wire fraud charges. He will be attempting to sell land he does not own to a federally insured corporation. The FBI will not offer plea deals for that level of financial deception. The developers will press charges. The loan sharks will realize they hold a useless lien, and the federal government will lock Logan in a concrete cell for the next 3 decades. Michelle will be indicted as a co-conspirator. We must let them walk right into the trap. We let them believe they have won. Anthony's phone vibrated violently against the diner table. He picked it up and stared at the screen. The encrypted security application connected to the hidden cameras at the estate was flashing red. Anthony tapped the notification and pulled up the live feed from the front porch. A dark blue sedan had just parked directly behind Logan's silver Mercedes. Two men stepped out of the vehicle. One was Logan. The other was an older man carrying a clipboard and a sophisticated laser measuring device. "Logan is moving faster than we calculated," Anthony said, his voice tight. "He brought a corrupt appraiser to the house. They are bypassing the standard waiting periods. Logan is actively measuring the exterior boundaries to push the illegal sale through before the end of the day. He is trying to finalize the developer's contract right now." Anthony floored the accelerator of the rental sedan tires, kicking up a thick cloud of gravel as we tore out of the diner parking lot. We covered the distance back to the estate in record time. I instructed him to drop me off near the tree line and wait out of sight. I needed to look the part of a man whose mind had completely unraveled. I unbuttoned my collar and violently tugged at the fabric, tearing the top seam. I rubbed a handful of damp Georgia clay into my trousers and across my knuckles. I reached into my jacket pocket, retrieved a small silver flask of bourbon I carried for fishing trips, and poured a generous splash directly onto my neck and chest. The sharp, pungent stench of cheap alcohol immediately clung to me. I stumbled up the porch steps, intentionally dragging my left foot to mimic a severe loss of motor control. I threw the heavy oak front door open with a deafening crash. The heavy wood slammed against the plaster wall, shaking the entire foyer. I staggered into the living room, my eyes wide and entirely vacant. Logan stood near the fireplace with a stout, balding man holding a digital clipboard. I did not give them a second to speak. I pointed a trembling, dirt-stained finger directly at the empty space where Martha's African tapestry used to hang. I let out a blood-curdling shriek. I screamed that the walls were bleeding. I frantically scratched at the plaster, shouting that the ghosts of the original settlers were trapped in the foundation and trying to claw their way up through the floorboards. I slurred my words heavily, projecting the exact image of a violent, unpredictable madman suffering from end-stage dementia. The corrupt appraiser took a rapid step backward, his face draining of all color. He clutched his clipboard against his chest like a shield. Logan lunged forward to grab my arms, but I violently swatted him away, maintaining my deranged performance. I stumbled toward the large bay windows overlooking the water. The appraiser had placed his expensive, high-precision laser measuring tool on the windowsill. I snatched the heavy device before either man could react. I unlatched the glass pane, swung my arm back, and hurled the $2,000 piece of equipment directly into Lake Sinclair. The splash echoed through the open window, marking the exact moment the appraisal process died. Logan screamed in sheer panic, reaching out toward the water, but I immediately spun around and grabbed the lapels of the appraiser's cheap suit. I pulled his face mere inches from my whiskey-soaked collar. I widened my eyes and whispered in a frantic, conspiratorial tone. I told him he needed to run before the house collapsed into the mud. I babbled incessantly about massive, undocumented structural damage hidden behind the drywall. I loudly claimed the basement was utterly consumed by toxic black mold that caused my wife's death. I swore the entire western foundation was actively sinking into a subterranean sinkhole, and that the local county inspectors had condemned the soil 3 years ago. The appraiser pried my hands off his suit, breathing heavily. He was a corrupt man willing to bend numbers for a bribe, but he was not an idiot. A property with extreme structural hazards, toxic mold, and a violent, legally contested owner sitting in the living room was a massive liability. He realized Logan had dragged him into a highly volatile, completely illegal mess that could easily cost him his appraisal license and land him in federal prison. The appraiser shoved his clipboard into his leather briefcase and backed quickly toward the front door, his eyes darting frantically between my intentionally crazed expression and Logan's heavily sweating face. I dropped to my knees, clawing at the hardwood floor and screaming that the toxic water was rapidly rising through the floorboards. The appraiser did not wait for an explanation. He turned his back on Logan and stormed out of the house. He yelled over his shoulder that the entire deal was completely dead. He loudly threatened to report Logan to the state real estate board for attempting to bribe him into appraising a structurally compromised property. The heavy front door slammed shut, severing Logan's last remaining lifeline to the commercial developers. Logan stood frozen in the center of the living room. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by his heavy, ragged breathing. The fake, charming facade he wore for society completely evaporated. His face twisted into a mask of pure homicidal rage. He realized his $3 million debt to the loan sharks was now entirely unpayable. He lunged across the room and grabbed me by the collar of my torn flannel shirt. He did not care about the senile act anymore. He yanked me off the floor with surprising, desperate strength. His knuckles dug painfully into my throat. He dragged me violently down the central hallway, my boots scraping against the polished wood. I offered zero physical resistance, letting my dead weight slow him down to maintain the illusion of my frailty. He hauled me toward the back of the house, specifically targeting the heavy steel door that led down to the old root cellar. He reached down and twisted the brass handle. He shoved me forcefully into the dark stairwell. I stumbled backward, my shoulders slamming hard against the cold concrete wall. I lost my footing and tumbled down the first flight of wooden steps, landing heavily on the damp, dusty basement floor. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain radiating through my spine, but I bit my tongue and remained completely silent in the shadows. The heavy steel door slammed shut at the top of the stairs, instantly plunging the cellar into absolute darkness. I heard the sharp metallic slide of the exterior deadbolt snapping securely into the doorframe. Logan had trapped me in a windowless concrete box. His muffled voice echoed violently through the thick steel. He screamed that I had just signed my own death warrant. He yelled that he did not care about the appraiser anymore. He declared that I would stay locked down in the freezing dark until the family court judge officially granted the emergency medical guardianship at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. He swore that the moment the gavel fell and my legal rights were permanently stripped away, he would hand me over to a state psychiatric ward and bulldoze the estate himself. The sound of his heavy footsteps stomped away down the hallway, leaving me in total silence. I sat up on the cold concrete floor, my ribs throbbing from the fall. I brushed the dirt from my jacket. Logan thought he had buried me alive. He had no idea he just locked me in the exact room where I kept my best tools. The pitch-black basement swallowed the last echo of the sliding deadbolt. I sat on the freezing concrete floor and pressed my hand against my ribs. A sharp, localized pain radiated heavily with every breath. I did not panic. I closed my eyes and forced my heart rate to slow down immediately. 30 years of interrogating violent men taught me that panic is a secondary injury that kills you significantly faster than the first. I inhaled through my nose and exhaled slowly, visualizing the exact dimensions of the root cellar. Martha and I had built these storage shelves 40 years ago. Every wooden beam, every concrete pillar, and every storage bin was permanently mapped in my spatial memory. I pushed myself up to a standing position. I kept my right hand trailing along the rough, damp concrete wall for orientation. I counted my steps. 7 paces forward, 2 paces left. My fingers brushed against the familiar cold, textured metal of my vintage heavy-duty toolbox. Logan had locked me down here assuming I was a helpless, fragile old man. He assumed this space was merely an empty concrete box designed for forgotten junk. He did not realize this cellar was my domain. I popped the heavy metal latches of the toolbox. The familiar metallic click resonated sharply in the total darkness. I ran my hands over the meticulously organized compartments. I needed a light source before I could dismantle the steel door at the top of the stairs. I reached into the bottom left compartment, feeling for the heavy tactical flashlight I always kept fully charged. My knuckles brushed against the cold wall behind the workbench. Something was wrong. The concrete surface was completely uneven. A deep structural groove cut right through the mortar line. I paused my search for the flashlight and traced the rectangular outline with my bare fingers. The brick was entirely loose. I pressed my palm flat against the cold clay surface and pushed inward. The brick shifted backward with a faint scraping sound. I wedged my fingernails into the gap and pulled the heavy block out of the wall, resting it quietly on the wooden workbench. I reached deep into the dark cavity. My fingers closed around a small, smooth, rectangular object wrapped in a plastic protective sleeve. I pulled it out and peeled back the wrapping. It was a cheap prepaid cellular phone. A burner. The screen remained dark. I pressed the power button on the side of the device. The harsh, bright backlight instantly flooded the pitch-black cellar, blinding me for a fraction of a second. I squinted against the glare and stared at the lock screen. Logan's overwhelming arrogance had always been his absolute greatest vulnerability. He despised the basement. He considered it dirty, damp, and completely beneath his designer lifestyle. He assumed I was entirely incapable of navigating the space or noticing a modified concrete block hidden behind a heavy workbench. He deliberately chose the one location in the house he believed I would never actively investigate to hide his illegal communications. He stored his criminal lifeline right beneath my feet. I stared at the numeric keypad, waiting for a passcode. A man who forged property deeds and manipulated federal housing markets would not use a complicated encryption sequence for a disposable phone. He would use something rooted deeply in his own massive ego. I typed in the 4 digits of his birth year. The lock icon vanished instantly. The home screen opened, revealing a sparse grid of applications. There were no contacts saved. There were no text message threads. There was only one application running actively in the background. It was an encrypted audio messaging platform designed to automatically delete files after a set period. I opened the application. A single unsent audio file sat in the outgoing queue. The destination contact was an alphanumeric string that clearly belonged to the private equity syndicate financing his fraudulent operation. I pressed play. Logan's frantic whispering voice leaked from the phone's tiny speaker. He was terrified. He was speaking directly to the head of the loan syndicate. The recording captured him begging for an extension on the multi-million-dollar collateral. He explicitly stated that the commercial developers were demanding the final clean title by the end of the week, or they would pull their funding entirely. Then the desperation in his voice morphed into cold, calculated murder. Logan outlined his ultimate contingency plan to the mob boss. He promised that if the local family court judge refused to grant the emergency medical guardianship by tomorrow morning, he would physically eliminate the problem. Logan detailed his exact method. He stated he had already researched the lethal dosage of my current blood pressure medication. He promised to force the pills down my throat and stage a massive fatal heart attack before noon. He assured the syndicate leader that an old man dying of cardiac arrest in his own home would never trigger a police homicide investigation. I stopped the recording. The digital file was not just evidence of financial fraud. It was a recorded confession of premeditated attempted murder. The federal prosecutors would not need to build a circumstantial case against him. This audio file was a lethal weapon that would guarantee him a life sentence without the possibility of parole. I forwarded the encrypted file directly to Anthony's secure server. I slipped the burner phone into my breast pocket. My survival was no longer a matter of outsmarting a corrupt family court system. I was actively hunted by a man who planned to execute me in a matter of hours. I turned my attention back to the heavy steel door waiting at the top of the stairs. I reached into the open toolbox and gripped the handle of a solid steel flathead screwdriver. I grabbed a heavy rubber mallet. I crept silently up the wooden steps, favoring my injured ribs. The deadbolt locked the door from the outside, but Logan failed to notice that the metal hinges were installed on the inside of the frame. I wedged the flat edge of the screwdriver directly under the top hinge pin. I struck the base of the handle with a sharp, controlled tap of the mallet. The pin shot upward and slid silently out of the cylinder. I repeated the exact same motion on the bottom hinge. The heavy steel door was no longer attached to the wall. I pressed my shoulder against the cold metal and pushed outward. The door shifted away from the frame with a soft, heavy groan. I stepped out into the dark hallway. I froze. A set of heavy, unfamiliar boots paced slowly and deliberately across the hardwood floorboards directly above my head. Logan had not returned alone. I pushed the heavy steel door open just enough to slip through the gap. The hallway was completely dark, but the violent tension radiating from the front of the house was unmistakable. I kept my back pressed flat against the floral wallpaper, moving silently toward the kitchen. The heavy, unfamiliar boots I had heard earlier belonged to 3 men standing aggressively around my granite kitchen island. They wore dark, thick leather jackets despite the sweltering Georgia heat concealing the bulk of their weaponry. The man in the center was built like a concrete pillar. He held a suppressed matte black semi-automatic pistol pressed directly against Logan's left temple. Logan was on his knees. His tailored designer suit was wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. He was shaking uncontrollably. The enforcer holding the weapon spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm. He informed Logan that their employer was severely displeased with his sudden radio silence. He explicitly stated they were not here to negotiate terms or grant extensions. They came to collect the $500,000 hard money loan plus 72 hours of exorbitant interest in untraceable cash. Logan tried to speak, but his voice cracked into a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. The second enforcer, a taller man with jagged scars across his jawline, casually pulled a long, serrated hunting knife from his belt. He slammed the blade down onto the granite countertop, stopping inches from Logan's trembling fingers. He demanded the money immediately, warning my son-in-law that commercial developers and forged property deeds meant absolutely nothing to men who buried bodies for a living. I remained hidden in the shadows of the hallway, watching the corporate shark finally face the brutal reality of the criminal underworld he thought he could effortlessly manipulate. Logan's arrogant corporate facade collapsed entirely. He dropped his hands to the floor, actively groveling at the heavy boots of the armed men in my kitchen. Tears of pure terror streamed down his flushed cheeks. He practically hyperventilated as he swore he did not have the liquid cash on hand. He frantically explained that the commercial developers had backed out earlier that afternoon, effectively killing his immediate capital. The man with the suppressed pistol pressed the hot barrel harder against Logan's skull, adjusting his grip to execute him right there on the expensive tile. Logan shrieked in absolute panic. He wildly pointed a trembling finger directly toward the hallway leading to the basement door. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of humanity or family loyalty. He told the enforcers that I was locked in the root cellar. He spun a rapid, desperate lie to buy his own life. He claimed that I was a paranoid, wealthy old man hoarding a massive, untraceable fortune. Logan swore to the loan sharks that I kept a hidden floor safe buried deep in the basement concrete, containing over $2 million in raw cash and solid gold bars. He looked up at the mobsters and explicitly instructed them to go downstairs, put a bullet in my head, and take every single cent for themselves. He offered my life to settle his fraudulent debt. He traded my blood to buy his own freedom. He assured the armed men that the local police would never aggressively investigate the murder of a senile old man who had completely lost his mind. The tall enforcer with the knife yanked his blade out of the granite. He looked toward the hallway, his eyes narrowing with violent intent. The leader kept his gun locked on Logan but nodded firmly to his two subordinates. He ordered them to head down to the cellar, crack the safe, and eliminate the old man without making a mess. Logan stayed on his knees, weeping with pathetic relief as he successfully directed a cartel hit squad to murder his wife's father. He thought he had outsmarted death. He thought the heavy steel deadbolt would trap me in the dark while armed killers executed me. I did not wait for the two enforcers to reach the hallway. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the harsh overhead lights of the kitchen. I did not raise my hands. I did not show a single ounce of fear. I held Logan's plastic burner phone tightly in my right hand. The three armed men instantly snapped their attention toward me. The leader seamlessly shifted his suppressed pistol from Logan's head to my chest. Logan's jaw dropped. His tear-streaked face contorted in absolute shock as he stared at the man he believed was securely locked behind a steel door. I ignored the weapon aimed at my heart. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the mob boss holding the gun. I stated with absolute clarity that there was no safe, no gold, and no cash buried in my basement. I told them Logan was lying to stall his own execution. I raised the burner phone and pressed my thumb against the brightly lit play button. The volume was set to maximum. Logan's own frantic, whispering voice echoed sharply off the kitchen cabinets. The high-definition audio file played his entire recorded confession. The mobsters listened in dead silence as Logan's recorded voice explicitly detailed his master plan to take the $500,000 loan skip the country and permanently relocate to a non-extradition compound in Costa Rica by the end of the week. The recording captured him actively mocking the syndicate, bragging to a silent accomplice that the mob would never track him through his international shell corporations. The audio file finished playing. I dropped the burner phone directly onto the granite island. The digital evidence sat undeniably between us, dismantling Logan's entire survival strategy in a matter of seconds. The mob boss lowered his weapon. A terrifying, grim smile spread slowly across his hardened face. He looked down at Logan, who was now trembling so violently his teeth chattered against each other. The enforcer did not scream. He did not issue a loud, dramatic threat. He leaned down and spoke in a near whisper that chilled the entire room. He told my son-in-law that the debt had just exponentially increased. He gave Logan exactly 24 hours to produce the original $500,000 plus a $200,000 penalty for attempting to flee the country. If the total sum was not wired into their offshore accounts by this exact time tomorrow, they would return, gut him alive, and bury his severed remains beneath the mud of the lake outside. The three men turned and walked out the front door without another word. The heavy engines of their sedan roared to life and faded quickly down the gravel driveway. Logan slowly pushed himself off the floor. His tailored suit was ruined. His corporate empire was dead. His cartel escape plan was completely destroyed. He turned his head and locked his eyes on me. The panic was entirely gone. Pure, unadulterated homicidal rage radiated from his stare. Segment 11.1, the courtroom. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Family Court swung shut, sealing us inside the sterile, wood-paneled courtroom. The morning light filtered through the tall, frosted windows, casting a harsh glare across the polished plaintiff's table. Logan sat completely upright, wearing a meticulously tailored navy suit and a carefully rehearsed expression of deep, tragic concern. He had spent the last 12 hours frantically scrubbing the terror from his face, replacing the mob's death threat with the mask of a dutiful, heartbroken son-in-law. Michelle sat directly beside him, dressed in a conservative black dress that contrasted sharply with her usual flashy attire. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her manicured hands, periodically dabbing at the corners of her dry eyes. Her performance was a masterclass in calculated victimhood. She leaned her head against Logan's shoulder, projecting the exact image of a devastated daughter watching her beloved father slip into madness. I sat at the defense table next to Robert Hughes. I did not glare at them. I did not shift in my chair or display a single ounce of anxiety. My ribs ached from the basement fall, a dull, throbbing reminder of Logan's violence, but my posture remained perfectly rigid. I wore my old pressed military-issue suit. I stared straight ahead at the judge's empty bench, allowing the silence in the room to build the tension. Robert calmly arranged his manila folders on the table, aligning the edges with absolute precision. He leaned over and whispered that the trap was perfectly primed. Logan believed the hearing was a mere formality to secure his financial lifeline. He had absolutely no idea the ground beneath him had already collapsed. Segment 11.2, The Corrupt Doctor. The bailiff announced the judge's arrival, and the courtroom fell into a tense, expectant silence. Logan's high-priced corporate litigator immediately took the floor. He did not waste time with introductory pleasantries. He launched directly into a vicious, fabricated narrative detailing my supposed rapid cognitive decline. He painted a picture of a violent, unpredictable old man living in squalor and endangering the entire community. To cement his claims, the lawyer called their star witness to the stand. A tall, impeccably groomed man in a sharp tweed suit stepped forward. He introduced himself as a leading private psychiatrist with a pristine specialized practice in Atlanta. He was the corrupt doctor Logan had bought to validate his lies. The psychiatrist swore under oath and confidently opened a thick medical file. He testified that he had thoroughly reviewed my behavior patterns and secondhand accounts provided by my deeply concerned family. He looked directly at the judge and declared with absolute medical authority that I suffered from advanced aggressive dementia coupled with severe paranoid delusions. He cited my fabricated claims about ghosts in the walls and structural collapse as definitive proof of a shattered mind. He warned the court that my physical strength combined with my complete loss of reality made me an imminent lethal danger to myself and anyone around me. He forcefully recommended immediate involuntary institutionalization in a locked psychiatric facility to ensure my safety and the safety of the public. The performance was chillingly clinical and perfectly delivered. The judge leaned forward, his brow deeply furrowed in genuine concern. He looked down at the emergency medical guardianship order sitting on his desk. He picked up his heavy brass pen. The legal threshold for emergency guardianship heavily favored protective action when a certified medical expert testified to imminent danger. The judge stated that the court's primary duty was to prevent harm to vulnerable seniors. He adjusted his glasses completely, buying into Logan's manufactured crisis. He moved the pen toward the signature line on the heavy parchment. Across the aisle, Logan exhaled a sharp, silent breath of relief. His entire body visibly relaxed. He stared at the judge's pen, watching his salvation inch closer to the paper. Michelle gripped Logan's arm, her fake tears entirely gone, replaced by a cold, victorious smirk. They were seconds away from legally stripping away my absolute freedom and securing the collateral they desperately needed to survive the mob. Segment 11.3, The Strategic Delay. Robert Hughes stood up just as the judge pressed the metal tip of his pen to the paper. He did not dramatically slam the federal neurological evaluation onto the desk. He did not reveal our ultimate weapon. Instead, Robert raised his hand and spoke with a smooth, authoritative legal cadence. He formally requested an immediate halt to the signature citing severe, glaring procedural violations in the plaintiff's filing. The judge paused, looking up with obvious irritation. Robert calmly stepped out from behind the defense table. He stated that an emergency guardianship order requires the complete transparent disclosure of all familial financial entanglements to prevent predatory asset seizures. Robert handed a thin stack of papers to the bailiff. He pointed out that Logan's legal team had completely failed to disclose a pending multi-million-dollar commercial real estate contract tied directly to my physical property. Furthermore, Robert noted that Logan had not provided the mandatory 48-hour financial review period required by state law. He argued that granting guardianship without verifying these massive financial conflicts of interest would expose the court to severe federal liability. The judge lowered his pen. The mention of federal liability instantly changed the temperature of the room. The judge scrutinized the financial disclosure statutes Robert referenced. Logan's lawyer jumped up frantically objecting and claiming the paperwork delay was a mere clerical oversight that should not impede urgent medical care. The judge completely ignored the objection. He slammed his gavel down, ruling that the financial discrepancies were too substantial to ignore. He officially delayed the final ruling, granting a mandatory 72-hour procedural stay for a full financial audit. The emergency guardianship was temporarily suspended. The gavel strike echoed through the room, sealing Logan's fate. Segment 11.4, The Desperate Order. Logan practically sprinted out of the courtroom, shoving past the heavy wooden doors. The 72-hour legal delay was a definitive death sentence. The mob syndicate had given him exactly 24 hours to wire the cash. He was completely out of time, out of legal options, and entirely out of sanity. I watched through the lobby windows as Logan paced frantically across the hot asphalt of the courthouse parking lot. He cornered the corrupt psychiatrist against the side of a luxury SUV. Logan's face was dark red, his movements erratic and violent. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope bulging with raw cash. He slammed the money into the doctor's chest. Logan grabbed the man by the lapels of his tweed suit, spittle flying from his mouth as he delivered a final, desperate ultimatum. The legal route was dead, and Logan needed me physically incapacitated immediately to satisfy the loan sharks. He ordered the psychiatrist to drive out to the lakefront estate tonight. He commanded the doctor to force his way into the house, inject me with a massive dose of unauthorized chemical sedatives, and plunge me into an irreversible medical coma before sunrise. The digital clock on the nightstand shifted silently to 2 a.m. The house was submerged in absolute darkness. The house was submerged in absolute silence. I sat in the heavy leather armchair tucked into the deepest corner of my bedroom. I did not move. I did not breathe loud enough to disturb the stillness. 30 years of hunting desperate men taught me that desperation breeds predictable patterns. Desperation breeds fatal mistakes. A faint, metallic scrape echoed from the back of the estate. It was the sound of tempered steel working against the brass tumblers of the mudroom door. The corrupt psychiatrist Logan had bribed in the courthouse parking lot was not a professional burglar. His movements were clumsy. His movements were frantic. His boots squeaked slightly against the hardwood floors as he crept down the long hallway toward my master suite. The floorboards betrayed his exact position. I watched the bedroom door handle turn with agonizing slowness. The hinges let out a soft groan as the heavy wood swung open. The ambient moonlight from the bay windows illuminated his sharp tweed suit. He was holding a large medical syringe in his right hand. The clear plastic barrel was entirely filled with a heavy, viscous liquid. It was a high-grade chemical sedative designed to stop a man's cognitive function instantly. It was a chemical designed to plunge me into an irreversible coma before the sun came up. He stepped into the room, his eyes locked entirely on the shape beneath my thick down comforter. He took one step closer to the bed. He took another step closer to the bed. He raised the needle, his hand trembling under the weight of his own criminal ambition. The doctor lunged forward with sudden, violent momentum. He drove his body weight downward and plunged the long steel needle directly into the center of the dark mass under the comforter. He expected the sickening resistance of human flesh. He expected the immediate muffled thrashing of an old man fighting for his last conscious breath. Instead, the needle sank effortlessly through layers of cotton and struck the solid wooden mattress frame beneath. He had injected the lethal dose of chemical sedatives straight into a neatly arranged pile of spare pillows. The realization paralyzed him. He stared down at the empty bedding, his breathing ragged and uneven. He stared down at the empty bedding, his mind scrambling to comprehend his massive failure. The heavy slatted door of the master closet swung violently open. Anthony stepped out of the shadows with the sheer kinetic force of a trained operative. He closed the distance before the doctor could even pull the needle out of the mattress. My son grabbed the man by the collar of his tweed suit, swept his leg, and slammed him brutally onto the hardwood floor. The heavy impact rattled the bedroom windows. The empty syringe clattered harmlessly into the corner of the room. Anthony drove his knee directly into the center of the doctor's spine, pinning him flat against the floorboards with overwhelming, inescapable pressure. He twisted the doctor's right arm forcefully behind his back, locking him in a hold that promised immediate dislocation if he dared to move an inch. I stood up from the leather armchair. I reached over and flicked the switch on the bedside lamp. The sudden blinding illumination flooded the room, stripping away every ounce of his concealment. I stepped into his field of vision. I held a high-definition digital video camera perfectly steady in my hands. The red recording light blinked rhythmically, capturing his terrified, sweat-drenched face. The red recording light blinked rhythmically, capturing the exact moment his prestigious medical career completely vaporized. He was caught executing a violent home invasion. He was caught administering a lethal biological weapon. He was caught acting as a disposable assassin for a fraudulent corporate shark. The camera recorded every hyperventilating breath he took as he realized he was going to spend the rest of his life inside a federal penitentiary. I lowered the camera slightly but kept the lens locked entirely on his panicked eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to convey absolute destruction. I offered him a brutally simple ultimatum. He could remain silent, and I would hand the high-definition footage directly to the district attorney. He would face immediate charges for armed burglary, conspiracy to commit murder, and the attempted lethal injection of a federal witness. He would lose his medical license. He would lose his freedom. He would lose everything. Or he could pull his mobile phone out of his pocket right now. He could dial Logan's personal number. He could put the call on maximum speakerphone volume and confess that the job was done. The doctor did not hesitate. His self-preservation instinct obliterated his loyalty to Logan's dirty money. With a violently trembling hand, he retrieved his phone and dialed the number. The line rang twice before Logan picked up. Logan's voice practically vibrated with manic anticipation. He demanded to know if the old man was finally neutralized. He demanded to know if the chemical sedative had completely destroyed my neurological functions. The doctor, reading the cold instruction in my eyes, choked out a confirmation. He told Logan the deed was done. Logan let out a sharp, breathless laugh of pure triumph. Logan explicitly stated that paying a medical professional to execute his father-in-law was the best investment he had ever made. He explicitly bragged that the family court judge would permanently transfer the estate to him by morning. The camera captured every single word of his damning confession. The audio recording was entirely flawless. The audio recording was entirely lethal. The trap had closed perfectly around Logan's neck. I reached down and ended the call, severing the connection before Logan could say another word. We had him. We had the definitive proof required to bury him under a mountain of federal indictments. The heavy silence in the bedroom was suddenly shattered by a sharp, piercing chime. It was a high-priority security alert. Anthony pulled his encrypted laptop from his tactical bag and flipped the screen open. His fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the origin of the digital alarm. His face drained of all color as the data populated on the monitor. He turned the laptop toward me. The screen displayed a live transaction feed from a secure offshore banking terminal located entirely outside our jurisdiction. The account belonged to Logan's primary shell corporation. Michelle was currently logged into the terminal. My own daughter was bypassing the dual-factor authentication protocols. My own daughter was actively draining the remaining $300,000 of liquid capital straight out of her husband's business account. She knew the mob was coming to collect. She knew the empire was collapsing. She was stealing the loan shark's money for herself, leaving Logan to face their violent wrath entirely empty-handed. The glow of the laptop illuminated Anthony's grim expression. I stared at the scrolling transaction bar. Michelle was systematically draining every single dollar Logan needed to survive. She knew the cartel had given him 24 hours to produce the cash. She knew failure meant a violent, shallow grave. She knew exactly what the consequences were, and she chose to abandon him to the wolves. She was leaving him to die. She was leaving him to be slaughtered. My own daughter possessed the exact same predatory survival instinct as the man she married. There was absolutely no loyalty among thieves. There was absolutely no loyalty in that marriage. I did not feel sorrow for her betrayal. I felt a cold, tactical clarity. I looked at the corrupt doctor pinned against the floorboards. His medical career was over, but he was merely a symptom of the disease. The real infection was currently tearing itself apart inside my home. I looked back at my son. I told Anthony to capture the live banking alert. I told him to bypass the standard encryption blocks. I instructed him to forward the active transaction notification directly to Logan's personal cellular phone. Anthony's fingers danced rapidly across the illuminated keyboard. He isolated the digital alert. He coded a direct, untraceable text message containing the exact offshore terminal location and the rapidly depleting account balance. He hit send. The digital strike was completely silent. The digital strike was utterly devastating. We did not need to break Logan's empire with lawyers or federal prosecutors tonight. We simply needed to hand him the undeniable proof that his own wife was holding the knife to his throat. Anthony instantly switched the laptop display to the high-definition security feed from the main living room. The room was bathed in the warm, ambient glow of the fireplace, presenting a picture of perfect manufactured domestic bliss. The illusion shattered a fraction of a second later. The heavy oak front door slammed open with enough force to crack the plaster wall. Logan stormed into the foyer. His designer suit was torn and stained with sweat. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He clutched his cellular phone in his right hand like a weapon. Michelle stood near the leather sofa. She had a designer trench coat draped over her arm. She was actively preparing to vanish into the night. Logan closed the distance between them in 3 massive, heavy strides. He shoved the glowing screen of his phone directly into her face. He screamed at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know where the money was going. He demanded to know why the offshore syndicate account was entirely empty. Michelle did not cower. Michelle did not beg for forgiveness. She matched his fury with a vicious, calculating coldness. She screamed right back at him. She yelled that his massive, idiotic gambling debts and failed real estate frauds had doomed them both. She declared she was absolutely not going down with his sinking ship. She declared she was absolutely not dying for his catastrophic mistakes. She told him the mob would kill him by tomorrow morning, and she intended to be on a private flight to Geneva before his body hit the bottom of the lake. Logan grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her violently, demanding she reverse the wire transfer. Michelle ripped herself free from his grip. She swung her arm in a wide, vicious arc. Her palm connected with the side of his face with a sharp, echoing crack. The slap snapped his head backward. The slap severed the very last thread of his sanity. The sharp echo of the slap lingered in the high ceilings of the living room. Logan stood perfectly still for a fraction of a second. The desperate, panicked corporate fraudster vanished entirely. A hollow, violent predator replaced him. A hollow, violent monster replaced him. He lunged forward before Michelle could take a single step backward. He did not aim for her arms. He drove his hand directly into her perfectly styled hair. He grabbed a thick fistful of blonde strands at the root and violently twisted his wrist. Michelle let out a piercing, terrified shriek. Logan yanked her forward with brutal, unforgiving momentum. He swung his entire body weight, throwing her forcefully across the center of the room. Michelle slammed hard into the edge of the heavy glass-topped coffee table. The impact shattered the thick glass into hundreds of jagged, shining shards. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor surrounded by broken glass. A thin, dark line of blood immediately streamed down from her split lip, staining the collar of her expensive blouse. Logan did not offer a shred of mercy. He did not offer a shred of hesitation. He marched over to where she lay gasping on the floorboards. He stood over her, his chest heaving with exertion. He pointed a trembling finger down at her bleeding face. He demanded the master passcode to the offshore terminal. He screamed that he needed the 12-digit encryption sequence right now. He swore that if she refused to surrender the access code, he would leave her locked in the house when the cartel assassins arrived tomorrow morning. He promised the mob would show her absolutely zero mercy. Michelle clutched her bleeding lip. She stared up at the man she had married. She saw absolute murder in his eyes. She saw absolute certainty in his threat. Her defiant arrogance broke instantly under the sheer terror of physical violence. She sobbed uncontrollably and choked out the 12-digit alphanumeric passcode. Logan immediately typed the sequence into his phone. He accessed the offshore terminal. He did not wire the funds back to the syndicate account to pay his debts. He initiated a direct, untraceable transfer of the entire $300,000 straight into his own private cryptocurrency wallet. The transaction cleared in seconds. The money was permanently gone. Logan shoved the phone deep into his jacket pocket. He turned his back on his bleeding wife. He walked straight to the foyer closet and kicked the door open. He grabbed a heavy, pre-packed leather duffel bag hidden beneath the winter coats. He did not look back. He did not say goodbye. He walked out the front door and sprinted toward his sedan. The engine roared to life, tires tearing through the gravel driveway as he fled the estate. He left Michelle weeping on the floor amidst the shattered glass. I stepped out of the shadows of the second-floor landing and walked slowly down the grand oak staircase. My boots made no sound against the thick carpet runners, but Michelle sensed my presence. She looked up from the center of the shattered glass. Her expensive designer blouse was completely ruined, stained with dark crimson from her split lip. She pressed a trembling hand against her cheek, tears carving through her perfect ruined makeup. She reached her other hand out toward me. Her voice was a broken, pathetic whisper. She begged me for help. She pleaded with me to call an ambulance and stop Logan before he ruined her entire life. She swore she had been manipulated, desperately trying to paint herself as a victim of his ambition. I stopped at the base of the stairs and looked down at her. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt absolutely no paternal instinct to comfort her. This was the woman who had laughed while plotting my forced institutionalization. This was the woman who had eagerly calculated how quickly I would die in a locked psychiatric ward so she could inherit my wealth. I looked directly into her terrified, tear-filled eyes. I told her with absolute chilling clarity that I would not lift a single finger to save her. I told her this was the exact destiny she had actively chosen. I stated that she had eagerly sold her soul and abandoned every shred of familial loyalty for a white man's money, trading her own flesh and blood for the illusion of corporate royalty. I reminded her that loyalty bought with cash evaporates the moment the accounts run dry. I turned my back on her weeping form. I left her bleeding on the floorboards amidst the sharp, broken fragments of the life she thought she had conquered. I walked back up the stairs and into the master suite, leaving the sound of Michelle's quiet sobbing echoing in the foyer below. Anthony sat at the desk, his fingers hovering over the illuminated keyboard of his encrypted laptop. I reached into my breast pocket and retrieved the cheap plastic burner phone I had liberated from the basement wall. The device felt surprisingly heavy, loaded with the immense leverage it provided. I unlocked the screen using Logan's incredibly predictable birth year. I scrolled through the recent call logs and selected the encrypted, untraceable number of the syndicate leader. The line connected immediately. The mob boss did not offer a polite greeting. He answered with a low, menacing breath, expecting the terrified voice of a fleeing debtor. He received my calm, steady voice instead. I introduced myself simply as the man whose basement Logan had just attempted to falsely pledge as collateral. The syndicate leader remained silent, a calculating pause that signaled he was actively listening. I told him I had a mutual interest in seeing his debt resolved, but more importantly, in ensuring Logan faced the absolute consequences of his boundless arrogance. I spoke with absolute, unwavering precision. I informed the mob boss that Logan had just executed a massive, untraceable transfer of $300,000 directly into a private cryptocurrency wallet. I emphasized that Logan had absolutely no intention of paying the syndicate a single cent. He was currently fleeing the state with their capital. I provided the exact make, model, and dark gray color of his rental sedan. I gave the mobster the license plate number Anthony had pulled from the rental agency database hours ago. I explicitly detailed that Logan was heading south, bypassing the local airports in favor of crossing state lines by ground. I offered the syndicate leader the ultimate tactical advantage. I handed him the exact coordinates of the man who had stolen from him. I did not ask for a reward. I simply requested that the mob handle their business thoroughly. The syndicate leader let out a short, grim chuckle. He thanked me for the precise intelligence and assured me that Logan would never step foot on a private flight to Geneva. The debt would be collected in full in blood if necessary. The line went dead. I placed the burner phone carefully onto the polished wood of the desk next to Anthony's laptop. My son tapped a series of commands onto his keyboard, bringing up a high-definition satellite map of the greater metropolitan area. A solitary, pulsing red dot glowed brightly against the dark grid of the highway system. Anthony had physically planted a military-grade GPS tracking node deep inside the rear bumper assembly of Logan's rental sedan days ago, anticipating a cowardly, desperate flight. We watched the red dot in absolute silence. Logan was driving with reckless, panicked speed. The tracker indicated his vehicle was pushing past 90 miles per hour as he merged onto the southbound lanes of Interstate 95. He was frantically attempting to put as much distance between himself and the syndicate as humanly possible before sunrise. He believed the cryptocurrency wallet shielded him from financial ruin. He believed the open highway guaranteed his physical survival. He was entirely wrong on both counts. We tracked his progress for 20 tense minutes. The red dot wove aggressively through the digital rendering of the interstate traffic. Then the inevitable sequence of events unfolded on the screen. The red dot suddenly veered sharply off the main highway corridor, sliding onto a desolate, unlit stretch of rural frontage road. Logan was attempting to evade the main traffic cameras, a classic maneuver of a terrified fugitive. 10 miles down the dark, isolated access road, the tracking signal flared brightly on the monitor. The red dot decelerated violently. The digital marker skidded across the map, rendering spinning wildly before coming to a dead, sudden halt. The dot stopped moving completely. It remained frozen on the shoulder of the empty road, indicating a violent kinetic impact. The absolute silence in the master suite was broken by a sharp electronic chime. The sound originated from the burner phone resting on the desk. I picked up the plastic device and opened the encrypted messaging application. A single high-resolution photograph loaded onto the screen from an anonymous sender. The image displayed Logan's dark gray rental sedan violently smashed into a deep, muddy ditch. The driver's side door was ripped completely open, hanging off its bent hinges. The driver's seat was entirely empty. The syndicate had executed a flawless vehicular ambush. They had driven him off the road, extracted him from the wreckage, and taken him into their custody. The loan sharks finally had their man, and they were going to extract their $500,000 through agonizing physical torment. I locked the phone and set it down. Tomorrow morning was the final mandatory hearing in family court. Logan was supposed to stand before the judge and finalize his fraudulent guardianship scheme. Instead, he was bleeding in the back of a syndicate van with absolutely no liquid capital left to trade for his miserable life. The board was perfectly set for total annihilation. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Family Court swung open precisely at 9 in the morning. The sterile fluorescent lights illuminated the polished mahogany benches and the judge's elevated desk. I sat beside Robert Hughes at the defense table, my posture perfectly rigid, my face entirely devoid of emotion. Anthony sat in the gallery directly behind me, his physical stance mirroring my own. The plaintiff's table remained empty for exactly 3 tense minutes. The silence in the room stretched until the rear doors groaned open once more. Logan stumbled into the center aisle. He was a complete physical wreck. The mob had kept their promise to extract their vengeance in blood before realizing his pockets were entirely empty. His tailored designer suit was torn at the shoulder and caked with dried mud from the roadside ditch. His left eye was swollen shut, surrounded by a deep, blossoming purple bruise. He walked with a pronounced, agonizing limp, dragging his right leg across the courtroom carpet. He collapsed heavily into his chair, clutching his ribs and breathing with a sharp, wet rasp. Michelle was nowhere to be found. She was miles away, hiding the scars of his domestic violence and counting her stolen cash. Logan's high-priced attorney immediately stood up, desperately attempting to salvage the disastrous optics. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me. He proclaimed to the judge that his client's severe injuries were the direct result of an unprovoked psychotic physical assault by a deranged old man. Logan leaned forward, wiping a fresh line of blood from his split lip and fully committed to the absolute lie. He swore under oath that I had ambushed him in a paranoid frenzy. He played the ultimate battered victim, begging the court to grant the emergency guardianship before I killed someone. The judge frowned deeply, his pen hovering over the emergency guardianship order. He looked down at me with a mixture of pity and grave concern, completely primed to sign my autonomy away, based on Logan's fabricated narrative of violent dementia. Robert Hughes stood up smoothly, adjusting his jacket with absolute calculated precision. He did not raise his voice to argue against the vicious lies. He simply walked to the center of the courtroom and handed a thick sealed document directly to the bailiff. Robert informed the court that the plaintiff's entire case relied upon the assumption of my cognitive decline. The bailiff passed the document to the judge. Robert formally submitted a comprehensive independent neurological evaluation conducted by 3 separate board-certified federal physicians. He stated clearly that the tests involved extensive brain imaging, psychological profiling, and cognitive stress exams. The judge broke the seal and scanned the official findings. Robert declared that the federal evaluation definitively proved I possessed a flawless, high-functioning mental capacity, entirely devoid of any dementia, paranoia, or psychosis. Logan's attorney jumped up loudly, objecting to the admission of the document and claiming it was a fabricated defense tactic. Robert did not flinch. He turned to the judge and stated that the plaintiff's desperation to secure a fraudulent medical diagnosis was already well documented. Robert pulled a small digital audio player from his briefcase. He placed it carefully on the edge of the judge's desk. He pressed play. The high-definition recording we had extracted from the corrupt doctor the previous night echoed clearly through the silent courtroom. Logan's own frantic, manic voice bounced off the mahogany walls. The judge listened in absolute horror as the recording explicitly captured Logan bribing the medical professional. The audio detailed Logan ordering the doctor to break into my house, inject me with high-grade chemical sedatives, and permanently plunge me into an irreversible medical coma before sunrise. The recording proved Logan intended to orchestrate my physical destruction to secure my assets. Logan slumped back in his chair, the remaining color completely draining from his battered face. The illusion of the concerned son-in-law evaporated instantly, entirely replaced by the undeniable audio footprint of a cornered murderous predator. Logan's attorney visibly paled, completely blindsided by the criminal audio recording of his own client. The lawyer frantically shuffled through his legal briefs, desperately searching for any technicality to salvage the multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deal that fueled his massive retainer. He ignored the attempted murder confession and shifted entirely to property law. He argued loudly that regardless of the medical guardianship dispute, Logan retained an active, legally binding power of attorney over the estate. He insisted that the pending sale of the lakefront property to the commercial developers must proceed immediately to prevent catastrophic financial damages. Robert Hughes smiled. It was a cold, surgical smile of absolute legal checkmate. He retrieved a final slim red folder from his leather briefcase and placed it squarely on the judge's desk. Robert announced that a power of attorney is only valid over assets the grantor actually owns. He formally submitted the binding executed documents of an irrevocable trust. Robert explained that I had legally transferred the absolute ownership of the lakefront estate, the liquid capital, and all associated land deeds into this impenetrable trust over 5 years ago. He looked directly at Logan and delivered the fatal blow. He declared that Logan had spent the last 6 months forging signatures and staking his entire corporate survival on a property I did not technically own. Robert turned back to the judge and stated that Logan's pending commercial sale contract was legally void. Furthermore, pledging a non-existent asset to secure a $500,000 private loan constituted massive premeditated federal wire fraud. Logan stared at the red folder, his breath catching in his throat as his entire financial empire officially collapsed into dust. The judge slammed his hands down onto the heavy mahogany desk. His face was flushed with absolute, unrestrained judicial fury. He looked at Logan with pure disgust, completely appalled that his courtroom had been manipulated to facilitate an attempted assassination and a massive corporate fraud scheme. He raised his heavy wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a deafening crack. He immediately struck down the emergency guardianship petition, officially dismissing the entire case with extreme prejudice. He ordered the bailiff to seize the audio recordings and the forged financial documents for immediate transfer to the district attorney's office. Logan tried to push his chair back, his panicked eyes darting toward the side exit. He intended to run to flee the devastating legal consequences closing in around him. The heavy rear doors of the courtroom suddenly swung violently open. 2 men wearing dark suits and tactical vests, clearly emblazoned with federal insignia, marched straight down the center aisle. The lead FBI agent locked his eyes on Logan and raised a sheaf of federal arrest warrants. He announced that Logan was under arrest for interstate wire fraud conspiracy to commit murder and extensive racketeering. The lead federal agent did not wait for the judge to formally dismiss the court. He crossed the mahogany floor with heavy, purposeful strides and grabbed Logan by the shoulder. Logan cried out as the agent forcefully twisted his arms behind his back, the sharp click of steel handcuffs echoing like a gunshot against the wood-paneled walls. The second agent stepped forward, holding a thick stack of federal indictments printed on official government letterhead. He informed Logan that his grand commercial real estate scheme was completely dead. The international developers had conducted an emergency internal audit after Robert Hughes flagged the fraudulent deed. They immediately filed federal charges for massive wire fraud. The agent leaned in close, ensuring every word resonated in the silent courtroom. He explained that Logan's fatal mistake was not just the forgery itself. Logan had utilized the United States Postal Service to physically mail the counterfeit property deeds across state lines to secure the developers' escrow funds. That single arrogant action elevated a state-level real estate scam into a series of federal mail fraud felonies. The agent stated with absolute chilling clarity that the federal prosecutor was seeking the maximum penalty. Logan was currently facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years inside a maximum security federal penitentiary before the attempted murder conspiracy charges were even fully processed. Logan stood paralyzed. The reality of his complete destruction finally penetrated his thick skull. His knees visibly buckled under the crushing weight of decades behind bars. The corporate shark was dead. He was now just a terrified criminal caught in an inescapable federal net. The bailiff stepped aside, allowing the federal authorities absolute jurisdiction. The gallery remained entirely silent, captivated by the absolute downfall of a man who had attempted to steal an empire. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit deeply into Logan's wrists. He tried to stammer a defense, a pathetic excuse about clerical errors, but the lead agent silenced him with a harsh tug on the metal chain. The 20-year federal sentence hung over Logan like an executioner's blade. Logan's physical strength evaporated entirely. His legs gave out. He dropped heavily to his knees right in the center of the judicial aisle, ignoring the sharp pain of his bruised ribs. The federal agents held him by the arms to keep him from completely collapsing onto the carpet, but he slumped forward, staring directly at me. The arrogant homicidal predator who had confidently ordered my death just hours ago was completely gone. In his place was a pathetic, weeping coward desperately grasping for a lifeline he had actively tried to sever. Tears streamed down his battered face, mixing with the dried blood from his split lip. He ignored the federal agents. He ignored the furious judge. He locked his desperate eyes entirely on my face. Logan begged for his life. His voice cracked into a high, hysterical pitch as he pleaded for my mercy. He screamed that he was family. He frantically reminded me that he was married to my only daughter. He claimed the entire conspiracy was a terrible, desperate mistake fueled by extreme financial stress and bad investments. He threw his pride away completely. Logan openly begged me to open my trust fund. He pleaded with me to wire the necessary millions to the commercial developers and officially settle his massive debts. He swore that if I just paid off the real estate firm and compensated the loan sharks, the federal prosecutors would lose their primary witnesses and drop the felony fraud charges. He promised he would leave the state. He promised he would divorce Michelle. He promised he would walk away with absolutely nothing if I just bought his freedom. The sheer audacity of his request hung heavily in the sterile air of the courtroom. After plotting to plunge a lethal syringe into my spine and bury me under a lake, he genuinely believed my paternal instinct would compel me to save him from federal prison. He thought he could extract my wealth one final time by weaponizing his pathetic tears. I looked down at the weeping man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely no compassion. I felt absolutely no pity. I watched him twist in the consequences of his own boundless greed. I slowly stood up from the defense table. I reached down and methodically buttoned the front of my military-issue suit jacket. I walked around the polished edge of the table and stopped exactly 2 feet away from where Logan kneeled in federal handcuffs. I looked down into his swollen, panicked eyes. The courtroom was dead silent. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that carried across the entire room. I told Logan that he fundamentally misunderstood the value of my wealth. I explained that I did not inherit a single dollar of my fortune. I built my empire through 50 relentless years of backbreaking honest labor. I reminded him that I had spent decades fighting against vicious systemic racism in the construction and real estate industries, fighting tooth and nail for every single contract, every acre of land, and every ounce of respect I possessed. My money was forged in sweat sacrifice and absolute integrity. I stated clearly that I would rather burn every last dollar of my trust fund to ashes than spend a single dime to save a cowardly parasite from federal prison. I told him he had gambled his life on the assumption that an old man was too weak to defend his legacy. I told him he had lost everything because he mistook my quiet patience for senile compliance. I told him his tears were completely worthless currency. My legacy was meant to build a foundation for genuine loyalty, not to act as a bailout fund for a murderous fraud. He had actively chosen his path the moment he forged my signature. The consequences belonged entirely to him. I turned my back on him. I did not raise my voice, but the finality of my refusal shattered his remaining hope. Logan let out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure despair. The lead FBI agent yanked him forcefully upward by his chained wrists, hauling the broken man toward the heavy courtroom doors. The lead agent stopped just before reaching the exit. He turned back toward the defense table and looked directly at Robert Hughes. The agent reached inside his tactical vest and retrieved a second, equally thick federal folder. He unsealed the clasp and pulled out another pristine arrest warrant bearing the official seal of the Department of Justice. The agent announced that their investigation into the fraudulent syndicate loan had uncovered an entirely separate layer of criminal conspiracy. He read the name printed boldly at the top of the federal document. The warrant was explicitly issued for Michelle. The FBI had successfully traced the digital footprints surrounding the $500,000 cartel loan. The agent declared that Michelle was officially charged with felony forgery and wire fraud. She had actively participated in the financial deception by personally falsifying my signature on the mob's collateral agreement. She had bound my estate to vicious killers to fund her own luxurious lifestyle. The federal authorities knew exactly what she had done, and they were actively moving to seize her. The trap had not just caught the arrogant son-in-law. The federal net was now closing rapidly around my own treacherous daughter. The sky over the lakefront estate broke open shortly after dusk, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour. I sat in my leather armchair by the unlit fireplace, listening to the heavy rain batter the massive bay windows. The estate was entirely silent, completely insulated from the federal chaos we had orchestrated in the courtroom hours earlier. That profound silence was violently shattered by the sound of frantic, desperate pounding against the solid oak of the front door. The heavy brass knocker clanged against the wood with an irregular, frantic rhythm. I did not move immediately. I let the desperate knocking echo through the grand foyer. The security monitors illuminated the pathetic scene playing out on my front porch. Michelle stood shivering under the harsh glare of the security floodlights. The torrential rain plastered her expensive blonde hair flat against her skull and ruined her designer trench coat. The jagged, dark purple bruise covering the left side of her face stood out in stark, horrific contrast to her pale, terrified skin. The deep cut on her lip had reopened, mixing fresh blood with the freezing rain streaming down her chin. She was no longer the arrogant corporate princess plotting to steal my legacy. She was a hunted fugitive with federal agents actively kicking down doors across the city to find her. She hammered her fists against the thick wood, her knuckles turning raw and bloody against the oak. She screamed for her daddy over the roaring wind. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging me to open the door, begging me to hide her from the federal authorities hunting her down. She was trapped in the violent storm of her own making, completely out of options and entirely out of time. She pressed her bruised face against the wet glass of the side panels, crying out that she had nowhere else to run. I stood up from my armchair and walked deliberately across the hardwood floor of the foyer. I reached out and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The lock disengaged with a sharp, heavy click. I pulled the massive oak door inward. The freezing wind immediately whipped through the entryway, bringing the smell of damp earth and ozone into the warm house. I stepped out onto the covered slate porch. I planted my boots firmly on the threshold. I did not step aside to let her in. I formed an absolute physical barricade between my treacherous daughter and the safety of my home. Michelle lunged forward, desperately trying to throw her arms around my neck. I raised my hand flat against her chest, stopping her forward momentum instantly. She stumbled backward into the pouring rain, her eyes wide with shock and pure terror. She collapsed to her knees on the wet slate, completely shattering whatever pride she had left. She begged me to hire the best federal defense attorneys in the city. She pleaded with me to shield her from the federal prosecutors looking to lock her in a penitentiary for the next 2 decades. She frantically claimed that she was completely innocent. She swore she never wanted to forge my signature on the syndicate collateral documents. She spun a desperate, pathetic narrative, loudly blaming Logan for every single criminal act. She insisted Logan had terrorized her, threatened her, and physically forced her to orchestrate the wire fraud. She pointed to the massive purple bruise on her face as undeniable proof of his violent coercion, sobbing that she was merely a helpless victim of a tyrannical, abusive husband. She promised to testify against him. She promised to do whatever the federal agents wanted if I just protected her. She looked up at me with mascara running down her cheeks, weaponizing her tears in a final desperate attempt to exploit my paternal instinct. She genuinely believed her bruised face would erase the months of calculated treachery she had inflicted upon this family. She expected the father she had plotted to destroy to suddenly transform back into her unconditional savior. I looked down at her kneeling figure without a single trace of empathy. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved a small digital audio player. I did not waste my breath arguing against her fabricated victimhood. I simply pressed the play button and turned the volume to its maximum setting. The high-definition recording of her own cold, arrogant voice cut clearly through the sound of the torrential rain. The audio captured her entirely uncoerced conversation with Logan in their luxury kitchen, eagerly discussing how quickly I would deteriorate inside a locked psychiatric ward. The device played her explicit instructions on how to perfectly forge my signature on the syndicate loan documents to secure their fraudulent real estate capital. The recording proved absolutely that she was not a frightened hostage. It proved she was the primary architect of the forgery. Michelle froze, the desperate lies dying instantly in her throat as she listened to the undeniable proof of her own treachery. I clicked the player off and placed it back into my pocket. I reached behind the door frame and picked up a heavy black industrial trash bag. I dropped the plastic bag directly at her knees. It hit the wet slate with a dull thud. The bag split open, spilling out faded denim jeans, worn cotton sweaters, and cheap canvas sneakers. It was the exact wardrobe she had worn the day she moved out of this house to marry Logan. I had ordered Anthony to box up the remnants of her old life years ago. I told her I was returning the only thing she actually owned before she decided to steal my legacy. I told her everything else she currently possessed was bought with blood money and federal fraud. I looked directly into her ruined, panicked eyes. I told her she had willingly sold her entire family out for a lavish, superficial lifestyle she could never legitimately afford. She traded her loyalty and her soul for the illusion of corporate royalty, and now she had to pay the exact price of her monumental arrogance. I stated clearly that my home was built for family, and I no longer recognized the woman kneeling on my porch. She reached out, screaming my name, begging for one more chance. I did not blink. I stepped backward across the threshold. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pulled the solid oak shut with absolute crushing finality. The heavy thud of the wood closing severed our relationship permanently. I engaged the deadbolt, the loud mechanical click echoing through the silent foyer. I turned off the exterior porch lights, plunging her completely into the dark. I walked away from the door, leaving her sobbing alone in the freezing, pouring rain, waiting for the federal agents to find her. The storm finally broke just before dawn, leaving the sky over the lake a brilliant, bruised purple. The heavy downpour had washed the slate porch clean of blood and despair. I stood by the bay windows, watching the early morning sunlight strike the calm surface of the water. The silence inside the house was no longer heavy with impending violence. It was the silence of a surgically excised tumor. Anthony walked into the foyer carrying a stack of heavy-duty moving boxes. We did not need to exchange a single word to understand the immediate objective. The physical manifestation of Logan and Michelle's toxic greed still contaminated the estate. We moved methodically through the ground floor, stripping away every single item they had purchased with stolen syndicate capital. I grabbed Logan's imported Italian golf clubs from the mudroom and dropped them into the first box. Anthony stripped the master closet of Michelle's designer handbags, her silk scarves, and the obscenely expensive leather jackets she had flaunted like royal vestments. We piled up the diamond-encrusted watches Logan had bought to project a facade of infinite wealth. We gathered the crystal decanters, the imported electronics, and the ridiculous overpriced modern art pieces they had forced into the guest suites to erase our family history. Every object felt physically heavy with fraud and betrayal. We tossed them into the boxes with absolute disdain. The piles grew rapidly, forming a massive monument to their monumental arrogance. We worked for 3 solid hours, purging the ancestral home of their synthetic, stolen lifestyle. We stripped the house down to its original, honest foundation. By the time we finished, the foyer was stacked high with cardboard boxes holding the entire pathetic sum of their criminal ambition. Anthony pulled a massive yellow rental box truck directly up to the front steps of the estate. The heavy diesel engine rumbled steadily in the crisp morning air. We worked in perfect synchronization, lifting the heavy cardboard boxes and shoving them into the cavernous cargo bay. The process felt like shoveling toxic waste out of a purified reservoir. I slammed the heavy metal roll-up door down and secured the steel latch. I handed Anthony the keys. I explicitly instructed him to ensure that not a single trace of their stolen luxury remained within our zip code. Anthony climbed into the driver's seat, grinding the heavy transmission into gear. He drove the truck straight out of the private gated community and headed deep into the industrial sector of the city. His first stop was a fortified, heavily secured women's domestic violence shelter, operating out of a repurposed brick warehouse. Anthony dragged the boxes of designer clothing, pristine leather jackets, and untouched silk scarves through the reinforced security doors. He dropped tens of thousands of dollars in high-end fashion directly onto the intake desk. He informed the startled facility director that the items were an anonymous donation meant to help battered women secure professional employment and regain their absolute dignity. He did not leave a name. He simply turned and walked back to the truck. He drove the remaining inventory to an underfunded youth outreach center struggling to survive on the city's forgotten South Side. He unloaded the imported electronics, the flat-screen monitors, and the expensive golf clubs. He told the center administrator to sell the luxury sporting goods to fund their after-school programs for the next 5 years. Anthony systematically converted Logan and Michelle's fraudulent corporate plunder into a lifeline for the desperately vulnerable. He weaponized their grotesque greed to actively rebuild the exact communities Logan had spent his entire career stepping on. Anthony returned to the lakefront estate 3 hours later with an entirely empty cargo bay. He parked the massive truck at the edge of the gravel driveway and walked back into the house. He handed me the keys with a sharp, satisfied nod. The physical infection had been completely eradicated. We had successfully recycled their poison into pure, undeniable salvation. The sharp crunch of tires on the gravel driveway announced the arrival of Robert Hughes. The brilliant attorney stepped out of his sleek black sedan carrying a thick leather briefcase. He walked up the porch steps with the calm, relaxed posture of a tactical general who had just won a completely decisive war. We sat at the heavy oak dining table. Robert opened the briefcase and spread the final banking documents across the polished wood. The financial architecture of Logan's scam had been thoroughly demolished. Robert explained that the federal investigators had successfully verified the comprehensive forgery of my signature on the syndicate collateral agreement. Because the corporate bank had processed a fraudulent deed transfer without executing the mandatory in-person biometric verifications, the financial institution was held absolutely legally liable. Robert smiled with cold, calculating satisfaction. He stated that the massive commercial bank was forced to completely absorb the $500,000 loss. The cartel's illegal lien against my property was legally obliterated, reduced to worthless paper by federal decree. The estate was instantly restored to its impenetrable, secure status within my irrevocable trust. Robert handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. I signed the final notarized declaration cementing my absolute ownership and locking the iron gates against any future corporate incursions. The financial defense was flawless. The legal fortress was entirely rebuilt from the ground up. Robert packed the executed documents back into his briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. He shook my hand with a firm, respectful grip. He promised that Logan and Michelle would never touch another dime of my legacy as long as they lived. He walked out the door, leaving my ancestral home entirely safe. I stood up from the dining table and walked slowly into the main living room. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long, peaceful shadows across the hardwood floor. The house felt remarkably light. The crushing atmosphere of deception had been thoroughly purged. I stopped in the center of the room and looked toward the grand stone fireplace. My eyes locked onto a barren, rectangular patch of plaster on the wall above the mantel. It was the exact spot where Martha's vibrant, hand-carved African art had hung for 3 decades. It was the beautiful heritage piece Michelle had violently torn down and thrown into the garbage because it did not match her sterile, modern corporate aesthetic. The empty space was a glaring physical scar. It was a stark reminder of the cultural erasure they had attempted to enforce upon this family. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the faded outline on the wall. The financial war was officially over. The legal battles were completely won. The physical threats were permanently neutralized. But looking at that empty frame, I realized the ultimate restoration of this family was just beginning. I turned away from the barren plaster wall and walked steadily toward the basement door. The heavy oak treads of the staircase groaned softly under my weight as I descended into the cool, dry air of the subterranean storage room. I navigated past the stacked cardboard boxes of seasonal decorations and stopped before a reinforced, climate-controlled wooden crate tucked safely in the deepest corner. I had moved it here the very night Michelle arrogantly declared her intention to remodel the estate to fit her sterile corporate vision. I unlatched the heavy steel clasps and pulled the wooden lid back. Martha's magnificent hand-carved African mural lay perfectly preserved inside, wrapped in protective canvas. The vibrant, earthy colors and intricate wooden textures seemed to pulse with the very soul of the woman who had brought it into our lives 40 years ago. I lifted the heavy mahogany frame with both hands, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of our shared history. I carried the mural back up the stairs, my steps growing lighter with every deliberate elevation. I walked back into the main living room and lifted the heavy carving toward the stone mantel. The brass hanging wire caught the original iron hook with a sharp, satisfying click. I stepped back to inspect the room. The glaring, sterile emptiness was instantly vanquished. The vibrant colors warmed the space, reflecting the afternoon sunlight exactly as Martha had intended. The cold, artificial atmosphere Michelle had aggressively forced upon these walls completely evaporated. The deep, lingering chill of betrayal finally left the room. For the first time since my wife passed away, the house did not feel like a contested battlefield or a highly coveted commercial asset. The estate finally felt like a home again. I walked away from the fireplace and moved toward the formal dining room. Anthony was already sitting at the long mahogany table, quietly reviewing a stack of the morning's financial ledgers. He looked up as I entered, his tactical, guarded expression softening slightly as he saw the mural securely anchored back in its rightful place. I pulled out the heavy wooden chair at the head of the table and sat down across from him. I reached inside the interior pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved a crisp, thick manila envelope. Robert Hughes had finalized these specific documents hours before the courtroom confrontation, waiting for my final authorization. I pulled the heavy parchment papers from the envelope and slid them directly across the polished wood toward my son. Anthony looked down at the bold federal lettering printed across the top page. It was the absolute ironclad succession plan for the irrevocable trust. I watched his eyes scan the intricate legal terminology. I spoke with absolute, unwavering clarity. I told him that an empire built on 50 years of blood, sweat, and systemic resistance requires a guardian capable of defending its borders against both external predators and internal parasites. I explicitly stated that Michelle had proven she viewed this family merely as a disposable stepping stone toward a synthetic, fraudulent aristocracy. She had forfeited her birthright the moment she handed the keys of our sanctuary to a syndicate pawn. I pointed directly to the signature line at the bottom of the page. I informed Anthony that these documents officially and permanently appointed him as the absolute sole executor of the entire estate. He was granted total legal dominion over the lakefront acreage, the liquid capital, and every single brick of the ancestral home. I told him that wealth is utterly meaningless without integrity, and he had proven his character by standing shoulder to shoulder with me against the wolves. I declared that the land would firmly remain in the hands of the only child who had actively bled to protect it. I handed him my gold fountain pen. I told him that this transfer of power was not a gift, but a heavy, sacred responsibility. He was not merely inheriting a piece of premium real estate. He was inheriting the enduring legacy of a family that refused to be broken, exploited, or erased by corporate vultures. The financial barricades were completely secure, and he was now the absolute architect of our future. Anthony stared at this gold fountain pen resting on the legal parchment. He did not rush to claim the immense wealth laid out before him. He processed the monumental weight of the succession plan with the quiet, calculated discipline of a soldier receiving a critical battlefield commission. He picked up the pen, the heavy metal gleaming under the dining room chandelier. He looked across the table, meeting my gaze with a profound, unspoken understanding. He saw the decades of quiet suffering, the brutal labor, and the absolute betrayal we had just surgically removed from our bloodline. Anthony uncapped the pen and pressed the gold nib against the signature line. His hand moved with smooth, deliberate strokes, permanently binding his name to the irrevocable trust. He set the pen down and pushed the executed documents back across the polished mahogany. He did not offer empty, emotional platitudes. He spoke with a quiet, lethal conviction that echoed the very foundation of my own soul. Anthony promised me that no corporate developer, no predatory loan shark, and no fraudulent syndicate would ever set foot on this property. He swore that the commercial real estate blueprints Logan had tried to force upon us would remain nothing more than discarded trash. He vowed that he would hold the perimeter against any future threat, preserving the deep, natural serenity of the lakefront exactly as Martha had always loved it. He promised that not a single inch of this soil would ever be sold, compromised, or surrendered. He looked at the restored mural in the adjacent room and pledged to maintain the absolute integrity of our history. The defense of the estate was no longer my solitary burden. The watch had officially changed. I walked over to the antique crystal decanter resting on the oak sideboard. I poured 2 generous measures of aged Kentucky bourbon into a pair of heavy glass tumblers. I handed one glass to Anthony and raised my own toward the warm afternoon light pouring through the bay windows. I proposed a quiet, resolute toast to Martha's enduring memory, to the unbreakable strength of the foundation she had helped me build, and to the absolute eradication of the infection that had tried to destroy us. Our glasses met with a sharp, clear chime that rang through the peaceful house. The burning warmth of the bourbon slid down my throat, settling deep in my chest. The dark, violently chaotic chapter of Logan's corporate treachery and Michelle's profound betrayal was permanently, irreversibly closed. I stood beside my loyal son, looking out over the calm, shimmering expanse of the private lake. For the first time in an agonizingly long year, I felt the deep, crushing tension slowly uncoil and leave my tired old bones. The storm had finally passed, and the estate stood entirely unbroken in the quiet golden light. The digital clock in the kitchen struck exactly 6 in the morning. A thick, impenetrable gray mist rolled heavily over the surface of the private lake. The mist swallowed the shoreline. The mist swallowed the towering pine trees. Anthony and I sat on the damp wooden benches of the old aluminum fishing boat. The metal hull sat perfectly level in the water. The water was perfectly still. It was a mirror reflecting the dawn. There were no flashing federal sirens tearing through the front gates. There were no corrupt lawyers waving fabricated legal documents in my foyer. There was no shouting echoing off the mahogany walls. The absolute silence of the wilderness had reclaimed the estate. The absolute silence of the wilderness had reclaimed my mind. The only sound in the freezing morning air was the rhythmic chirping of hidden crickets in the tall reeds. The only other sound was the gentle, methodical splash of Anthony dipping the wooden oars into the dark water. He rowed us toward the center of the lake with deliberate practiced strokes. The physical rhythm of the oars pushing against the water grounded us in the present reality. The violent storm of corporate theft and familial betrayal had passed. The violent storm was utterly defeated. We were left entirely alone in the pure, uncorrupted sanctuary of the land I had bled to secure. The cold mist dampened my heavy wool coat, but I did not shiver. I felt a profound warmth expanding in my chest. The toxic infection had been cut out of my home. The toxic infection had been cut out of my life. The boat glided silently through the fog, severing the surface of the lake and leaving a smooth, undisturbed wake behind us. Anthony shipped the oars and let the aluminum boat drift to a natural halt. He reached down and meticulously prepared his fishing line. He did not look at me directly when he finally broke the silence. He stared down into the dark, fathomless water. He asked me if the crushing weight of losing Michelle would ever truly evaporate. He asked me if the agonizing pain of severing my own daughter from our bloodline would eventually fade. The question hung heavily in the cold morning air. The question demanded an absolute, unflinching truth. I turned my head and stared out at the jagged tree line cutting into the brightening horizon. I did not offer him a comfortable lie. I did not offer him a gentle paternal platitude. I told him that the pain of betrayal is a permanent physical scar. I told him the pain of betrayal fundamentally rewrites the architecture of a man's heart. I explained that I would carry the memory of her greed until the day I drew my final breath. But I also told him to look at the massive ancient oak trees lining the eastern shore of our property. I pointed to the jagged, calloused sections of bark where lightning had struck decades ago. I stated with absolute clarity that a massive tree cannot survive if a diseased, rotting branch is allowed to remain attached to the trunk. The rot will inevitably spread down into the core. The rot will inevitably infect the roots. The rot will absolutely murder the entire organism from the inside out. I looked directly into Anthony's eyes. I told him that Michelle had chosen to become the rot. She had willingly allowed Logan's synthetic, poisonous ambition to infect her soul. She had eagerly calculated the exact hour of my death to fund her designer lifestyle. I told my son that severing her from this family was not an act of vengeance. Severing her from this family was an act of vital, necessary preservation. I had to prune the dead wood so the roots could survive. I had to amputate the infection so the legacy could endure. The pain of the cut was severe, but the survival of the tree was absolutely paramount. Anthony listened to the unvarnished truth. He slowly nodded his head, absorbing the brutal necessity of the amputation. The heavy sorrow in his posture lifted. The heavy sorrow dissolved into a grim, unshakable understanding. I turned my attention back to the heavy fiberglass fishing rod resting in my calloused hands. I cast the weighted lure far out into the center of the lake. The small splash broke the glassy surface, sending perfect concentric ripples radiating outward through the mist. I gripped the cork handle tightly. I waited with the absolute patience of a man who had spent 50 years building an empire from nothing. Suddenly, the fiberglass rod violently jerked downward. A massive kinetic force struck the end of the line deep beneath the water. The thick nylon string pulled taut, vibrating with immense, frantic tension. I did not panic. I did not rush the extraction. I planted my boots firmly against the aluminum hull of the boat. I engaged the reel with steady, flawless, practiced hands. The fish fought with desperate, explosive power, attempting to dive back down into the impenetrable darkness of the lake bed. I countered every single violent surge. I pulled back on the rod, leveraging the heavy weight against my shoulders. I cranked the reel with relentless mechanical precision. My arms did not shake, my grip did not falter. The muscle memory of 5 decades of manual labor engaged perfectly. I brought the thrashing surface of the water closer. I pulled a massive dark green largemouth bass up through the gray mist. The creature broke the surface, thrashing wildly in the morning air. I secured the catch and lifted it smoothly over the edge of the boat. I looked at the powerful fighting fish, and a deep, genuine smile broke across my face. Logan and Michelle had foolishly believed I was weak. They had eagerly assumed my strength had evaporated with age. They were entirely wrong. My strength was never gone. My strength was merely resting in the silence. My strength was simply waiting for the exact necessary moment to strike. I carefully unhooked the massive bass and released it back into the dark water. I watched it vanish instantly into the depths. I turned around in my seat and looked back across the expanse of the lake. The rising sun finally burned through the thick gray mist. The brilliant morning light illuminated the 50-acre estate standing tall and permanent against the shoreline. The heavy stone chimneys and the sprawling oak porches glowed in the dawn. The land was absolutely safe. The ancestral borders were completely impenetrable. My financial legacy was permanently locked away from corporate vultures. My personal dignity was entirely intact. I reached down and poured 2 measures of dark-aged Kentucky bourbon from a silver flask into 2 heavy glass tumblers. I handed one to Anthony. We raised our glasses toward the magnificent house. We drank a silent, profound toast to Martha's enduring memory. We drank to the absolute survival of her sanctuary. The darkest, most treacherous chapter of this family's history was permanently closed. I picked up my fiberglass rod and cast the heavy line back out into the center of the water. I sat back on the damp wooden bench. I finally let the morning air fill my lungs. The story ended exactly as it needed to end. It ended with absolute, unshakable peace. True loyalty cannot be bought, and betrayal always carries a heavy, unavoidable cost. When you build a life on deceit and greed, the foundation will inevitably crumble, leaving you entirely exposed to the storms of your own making. Greed blinds people to the value of genuine love, replacing authentic connection with superficial ambition. A strong foundation requires absolute integrity, rigorous honesty, and unwavering respect. Actions have inescapable consequences, and no amount of manipulation can permanently shield you from justice. Setting firm boundaries against toxic family members is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of absolute vital survival. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments how you would handle this level of family betrayal.